Story 1.
After discovering my wife's cheating with the mayor, I planned and executed epic revenge on them both. My daughter urgently requested my presence, expressing concern about her mother's involvement with someone else. Despite the distance, I could discern her distress through the grainy video quality. I learned that my wife spent several nights a week with a man named Donald Connolly, the mayor, known for his big fancy car and occasional limo rides. Stacy, my daughter, shared details about his appearance and confirmed her fear about the situation, prompting me to assure her that I would try to come home. Stacy pleaded for my swift return, emphasizing the need for discretion in dealing with her mother. I promised to do my best, expressing love for her before ending the conversation. My name is Robert Crawford. I'm 42 years old and a design specialist for a large electronics firm. I'm also a major in the National Guard, and that's why I'm currently on a year-long assignment in Afghanistan, where I serve on the command staff. I've been married to the love of my life, Kathy, for 18 years, and the fruit of our union is our awesome 15-year-old daughter, Stacy. Kathy is 40 but looks even younger. She's the most beautiful woman I've ever known. 5 feet 6 inches, in terrific shape that actually improved after she gave birth to our daughter. Her dark brown hair falls to her shoulders, and she has warm brown eyes that always sparkle when she smiles, and she smiles all the time. I could honestly say our marriage has been rock solid, even when I've been deployed. Our time together has been warm and loving, our lovemaking hot and always satisfying. I've never had a doubt about her fidelity, nor she mine. So, what happened? I didn't have a clue. I completed all the necessary paperwork for 30 days of emergency family leave and caught a flight that, 26 hours later, found me renting a car at my hometown airport and heading for home on Friday night around 6:30. I parked the car half a block from my house. The mid-November sun had set, and the streetlights cast an ominous glow on the neighborhood. Lights were on in the living room, kitchen, and upstairs master suite. I observed my wife moving around the house, appearing to get ready to go out. I discreetly called my daughter's cell phone, and she answered after 3 rings, speaking softly. I reassured her and asked if her mother was going out. She confirmed that her mother had been in her room for over an hour, heard the shower, and sensed her excitement for the night. Stacy expressed her dismay, wondering why her mother was putting the family through this. I advised against passing judgment until we knew the full story. Stacy asked about my plans, and I mentioned that I intended to follow them and assess the situation before deciding how to respond. She urged caution and asked if I needed to change clothes. I declined, mentioning that my camo fatigues would suffice for the occasion. We exchanged expressions of love, and I assured Stacy that we would always be together, regardless of the circumstances. At 7, a black Mercedes rolled into my driveway, and a tall, slender, well-dressed man emerged from the car. I anticipated him heading to the door, but instead, he conversed on his cell phone, and the lights in the master suite went dark. A minute later, the door opened, and my wife stepped onto the porch. She ensured the door locked behind her and briskly walked toward her date, wearing a big smile. Despite looking stunningly beautiful, my heart shattered when I saw her glance back at the house to make sure Stacy wasn't watching. Then she shared a warm kiss with the mayor before he helped her into the car and they drove away. Fortunately, I remained composed enough to capture the kiss with my cell phone. I followed them at a safe distance, encountering no issues due to the light traffic. They crossed town and arrived at the Ryzen Hotel's parking lot. Parking a few spaces away, I observed as they exited the car and entered the building, walking closely with arms around each other. I snapped another photo, revealing the evident long-term nature of their affair. They appeared so comfortable together, resembling a loving married couple on a date night. I waited until they entered the hotel before donning my camo hat and sunglasses and trailing behind them. Once inside, I couldn't see them, but it didn't concern me. I received the usual smiles and "thank you for your service" comments, which I acknowledged while checking the information board listing current events. One event stood out, the St. James Hospital Charity Ball on the 3rd floor, with live orchestra music filtering down to the lobby. Disregarding the elevator transporting couples to the ballroom, I opted for the stairs, avoiding swift detection and acknowledging the need for exercise after long flights. On the 3rd floor, I followed the music and easily found the ballroom. Passing the entrance, I glimpsed them inside, acting like the happy couple they portrayed, greeting friends and supporters. My wife briefly looked back at me, but there was no recognition. As far as she knew, I was still 10,000 miles away, facing flies, sandstorms, and the Taliban. I also noticed she wasn't wearing her wedding rings. After passing the entrance, I entered the men's room, sat in a stall, and contemplated my next moves. It was challenging to grasp what I had seen. I had been certain my marriage with Kathy was as solid as any could be. I felt foolish. While honoring my duty in Afghanistan, my loving wife was at home dishonoring me, breaking our wedding vows. What was wrong with the people they were meeting? Didn't they realize the woman hanging on the mayor was married to an army officer serving overseas? Warm tears ran down my cheek, but I wiped them away. No time for self-pity. I had a plan to formulate and execute. At that moment, a much different enemy needed to be faced than the Taliban. Remaining in the bathroom stall for half an hour, I allowed the festivities to reach full swing before approaching the ballroom door. Only a few people at the entrance noticed me as I edged close to the wall and walked slowly to an area away from the bar and food tables. Behind a pillar, I had a clear view of most of the room. Although I lacked a ticket for the event, my uniform held more clout than any piece of paper. The young man taking tickets saluted me and said, "Welcome, sir," as I entered. The thought crossed my mind, it's unfortunate my wife and her lover don't show that kind of respect for me in the uniform I wear. It took me a few minutes to locate Kathy and her date. They were dancing to a slow song, my wife's arms around his neck, her head against his chest, his hands resting possessively on her bottom. I managed to take several photos, but it took all my willpower to keep from rushing onto the floor and decking the guy, kicking his balls up into his kidneys. However, that would only give me a little satisfaction and likely put me in jail. What I wanted, what I needed, was absolute proof of their affair. And then I would find an appropriate way to exact revenge for their total disrespect of me, our daughter, and the U.S. Army. They danced another dance, then, arm in arm, made their way to their table, sharing an unfaithful kiss and caress before they sat down. I captured it all in photos. Having seen enough for the moment, I made my way out to the hallway and found a seat where I could watch the ballroom doors and the elevators. As an Army officer, I had learned patience, and it paid off, since another 2 hours went by before the event began to wind down and people made their way out the door and down the elevators. It wasn't long before my wife and the mayor made their exit and stood just outside the door talking. After a minute, they smiled at each other and turned together to the bank of elevators on their left. But instead of pushing the down button, they chose the one that would take them up. It was more than weird. I was only about 15 feet from them, sitting on a bench against the wall, wearing my camo fatigues and sunglasses, my name tag clearly displayed on the front of my uniform, looking totally out of place amid the tuxedos and ball gowns. And though many other couples noticed me and smiled or waved, my wife and her lover were so tuned into each other that they never gave me a glance. Observing them entering the elevator, holding hands, I noted that their car stopped on the 11th floor. After confirming it didn't go up again and returned to the 3rd floor where more couples were waiting, I headed back to the registration desk. I explained to the attendant that I had an urgent message for Mayor Connolly and showed my government ID, requesting his room number. Despite initial hesitation, she eventually disclosed that he was in room 1114. Thanking her, I took the elevator to the 11th floor and located room 1114. After checking the hallway for other occupants, I pressed my ear against the door, hearing only soft conversation. Unsatisfied, I proceeded down the hall, found the door to the stairs and secured it with my handkerchief to prevent it from locking. Glancing at my watch, I noted it was midnight. As Stacy had mentioned, her mother usually came home between 2 and 3, and once lately at 7. So I had a long wait, but again my Army training and patience paid off. Through the window in the door, I could see room 1114, so I wouldn't miss them when they were done with their lovemaking fest. As I waited, I tried to keep my mind on the task at hand, but the truth is, I kept imagining her lover plunging his tool deep into my wife, who had pledged to be mine alone. I could say my heart was broken, but it went far beyond that. I could feel my life spiraling down into a dark abyss where only pain, rejection, and humiliation were left. I knew I had to keep myself composed for my daughter's sake, but the realization that the woman I loved more than anything else on earth, whom I trusted with every fiber of my being, was at that very moment giving her body and soul, her love and passion, to another man overwhelmed me with a tidal wave of pain. Around 1:30, I stepped out of the stairwell and pressed my ear against their door, hearing faint sounds that resembled moaning. Then I distinctly heard my wife exclaiming, "Yes, oh God, yes, do me, Don, do me hard like that, you're so good," she screamed, a sound I had heard many times before during intimate moments with me. With tears streaming down my cheeks, I returned to the stairwell, anticipating they would conclude soon and leave their love nest. Within the next hour, I exited the stairwell for the final time at 2, positioning myself against the wall outside their room, ready to capture their exit on my cell phone's video. 15 minutes later, I heard the chain being removed and the door click open, and I began recording as they emerged. He had his arm protectively around her, and she leaned against him, smiling. Kathy looked freshly scrubbed and well-groomed, while Donald Connolly appeared pleased with himself. They kissed briefly, turned towards the elevators, and Kathy noticed me leaning against the wall. I confronted Kathy about her actions, questioning how her rendezvous with her lover went. Upon realizing my presence, Kathy appeared shocked, placing her hand on her heart and expressing disbelief. She fell to her knees, pleading that this wasn't supposed to happen, and that I wasn't meant to see it. Her lover, taking a moment to register the situation, insisted that it wasn't what it seemed, claiming that Kathy was merely assisting with his new campaign. I sarcastically remarked on the irony of such campaign tactics involving infidelity. I questioned the mayor's morality, highlighting the impact on my marriage while I was away serving the country. The mayor attempted to deny any close involvement, urging Kathy to corroborate his story. Disregarding his plea, Kathy rejected his attempt to manipulate the situation, recounting the witnessed kissing, moaning, and phrases heard through the door. I conceded defeat, acknowledging that my wife was now his, expressing frustration, and calling them both cowards. I emphasized that even my daughter was aware of their actions. The mayor stood there, stunned and unsure how to respond, while my wife knelt on the floor, sobbing. I informed Kathy not to bother coming home that night and suggested she spend it with her lover instead. I mentioned my intention to comfort our daughter and stated that on Monday I would file for divorce, followed by informing the news media, expressing my frustration about the mayor's actions in running the city. I instructed Kathy to stay away until I returned from my 30-day emergency leave, after which she could decide how to proceed with her life. Kathy pleaded with me, asking for forgiveness for her infidelity during my deployment and requesting not to disclose it to our daughter, who already knew about the situation. I expressed my confusion over her actions, but acknowledged that they had chosen each other. Disheartened, I left for the elevator as Kathy apologized, but I couldn't find it in me to accept her remorse. Observing their apparent happiness together, I left them with a harsh farewell and stepped into the elevator, leaving them behind. When I arrived home, I found Stacy waiting for me, clearly upset. She embraced me tightly, expressing how much she had missed me. I reassured her of my own feelings and confirmed that I had found her mother and the mayor together. Stacy affirmed that she wasn't concerned about her mother's absence, stating that she had felt neglected in her absence. She pleaded to come with me when I returned to Afghanistan, but I explained that she needed to stay here. Stacy insisted that she couldn't stay with her mother, expressing her resentment towards her. Despite her feelings, I reminded her that her mother was still her mother. Stacy tearfully expressed her belief that her mother didn't love her and sought comfort in my arms. I held her as she cried. I finally convinced Stacy to go to bed, and I secured the house, including setting the door chains, just in case Kathy decided to try to come home. I had no proof that Kathy and her lover had used any of our bedrooms for their trysts, but I didn't want to take a chance, so I slept on the couch, even though I wasn't sure they hadn't made love there either. Sleep came only in spurts, 45 minutes here, half an hour there. I kept thinking about how I would handle the situation when Kathy came to claim her clothes and personal items she'd need until I left in 30 days. I could have been a nice guy and taken a hotel room, leaving the house to her, but I just couldn't find it in my heart to be that nice. She was the one that destroyed our marriage, so she could at least suffer the minor inconvenience of being displaced from her home for a month. Besides, I'm certain her lover would be happy to put her up. They've been acting like a married couple. Now they could live like one for a while, call it a trial marriage. Stacy and I both slept until noon, or at least until around noon. I woke up first and prepared coffee, then made toast and scrambled eggs for us. We engaged in small talk while eating, and then proceeded to rinse the dishes and load them into the dishwasher. Suddenly, the phone rang, and Stacy and I exchanged glances before she answered it. Stacy spoke with her mother, expressing skepticism about her sincerity. She mentioned the ongoing affair with Donald Connolly and emphasized that it wasn't a one-time mistake. Stacy admitted to being the one who urged me to return home, highlighting her mother's neglect and obsession with her affair. Despite her mother's plea not to hurt Mayor Connolly, Stacy refused to comply, indicating her frustration and disappointment. After the call, Stacy remarked on her mother's apparent confusion and lack of understanding regarding the situation. She expressed her concern that her mother didn't grasp the gravity of her actions and couldn't comprehend why I didn't want her to return home. I reassured Stacy that her mother's lack of understanding would become apparent as consequences unfolded. The rest of the day passed quietly, with attempts to distract ourselves from thoughts about Kathy and Mayor Connolly. We discussed Stacy's future plans, with me suggesting she stay in her current environment, despite her concerns about her friend's reactions to her mother's actions. I told her that real friends would stand beside her, but she wasn't convinced. We settled things with my assurance that I'd call my mom to see if Stacy could stay with her until my deployment ended, hopefully in another 5 or 6 months. Late in the afternoon, the phone rang again. It was Kathy. I answered, but as soon as I heard Kathy say, "Bob, oh Bob, please give me a chance to explain," I passed the phone to Stacy without saying a word. "What, Mom?" Stacy's voice was hard and cold, and she held the phone away from her ear so I could hear what her mother was saying. Kathy insisted on speaking with Stacy's father, despite Stacy's resistance. Stacy demanded an explanation for Kathy's actions over the past 6 months, accusing her of betraying their family. Kathy defended herself, claiming she didn't intend to hurt anyone, while Stacy continued to express her disappointment and anger. Throughout their conversation, Kathy could be heard crying. Stacy expressed her hurt and disappointment towards her mother, emphasizing the pain caused to their family due to Kathy's actions. Kathy responded by expressing her love for Stacy and her husband, prompting skepticism from Stacy. Kathy then quietly requested some personal items, including clothes and birth control pills, expressing regret and frustration. Throughout the conversation, Kathy could be heard crying. Stacy sarcastically remarked about Kathy potentially becoming pregnant with the mayor's child and the inconvenience it would pose. She then mentioned packing Kathy's belongings, including clothes and birth control pills, and hinted at Kathy's need for makeup to maintain her appearance as the town's social figure. Stacy concluded by stating that Kathy's belongings would be left at the curb for her to retrieve. After ending the call, Stacy started crying, and I comforted her by wrapping my arms around her. I acknowledged that she had been tough on her mom, but I understood her anger. I assured her that we would overcome this situation together. After giving her another hug, I left her to gather the items her mother needed. I retreated to my office to strategize, drawing on my military training to meticulously plan our next steps. I viewed the situation as a battle that required careful planning and execution. The tasks I needed to handle were mostly straightforward. I planned to hire a divorce lawyer, cancel our joint credit cards, obtain separate credit cards for myself and Stacy, change the beneficiary on my life insurance and retirement plans to Stacy, and transfer half of the funds from our checking and savings accounts to new accounts accessible only by Stacy and me. However, figuring out how to deal with Mayor Connolly posed a greater challenge. I believed he deserved punishment for his actions, and I wanted to ensure he was exposed as the cowardly, wife-stealing individual he truly was. Later that evening, around 8, I received a phone call at home. Answering, I identified myself as Robert Crawford. The caller introduced himself as Ray Swanson, a city councilman and a friend of Mayor Connolly. He expressed a desire to discuss what he referred to as a little misunderstanding involving me, my wife, and the mayor the previous night. I found his choice of words concerning, especially considering the gravity of the situation involving my wife and Mayor Connolly's affair. Ray expressed his belief that there was no need for harsh language, suggesting that the situation involved a simple late-night gathering between consenting adults who had perhaps overindulged in drinks. He seemed optimistic that discussing the matter could resolve everything. However, I rebutted, stating that Mayor Connolly had been involved in an affair with my wife for the past 6 months while I was deployed in Afghanistan, and I had caught them together the previous night. Ray acknowledged the difficulty of the situation for me, but hoped we could find a resolution for everyone's benefit. I retorted, questioning who exactly he meant by everyone, emphasizing that my primary concern was for my daughter and that the concerns of others were of little importance to me. Ray expressed his concern, mentioning the mayor's influence in the community and the potential consequences for anyone who caused damage to his reputation. In response, I asked if he was making a threat, to which Ray clarified that he was merely stating the reality of the situation and expressed his reluctance to see damage come to me or my loved ones. I then issued a warning to Ray, urging him to listen attentively. I emphasized my experiences dealing with the Taliban over the past 6 months, indicating that I would not shy away from confronting someone like Mayor Connolly, whom I described as a dishonorable individual involved in stealing another man's wife. I asserted that neither Ray nor the mayor had faced an opponent of my caliber before. I conveyed to Councilman Swanson that I was unfazed by his perceived power and warned him of the consequences of challenging me. I mentioned that my soon-to-be ex-wife had neglected to inform the mayor of the repercussions of involving herself with me. Furthermore, I highlighted the extensive support network I had among former military personnel within a 100-mile radius, emphasizing our disdain for individuals who exploit soldiers' spouses during overseas deployments. I advised Councilman Swanson to distance himself from Mayor Connolly to avoid facing the repercussions of his actions, hinting at the impending consequences for the mayor. Ray attempted to negotiate with me, suggesting that a substantial sum of money could resolve the situation. However, I dismissed his proposal, expressing my intense anger toward Donald Connolly for exploiting a soldier's wife while I was deployed. I asserted that no amount of money could alleviate the pain caused to my daughter and me. I insisted that the only resolution satisfactory to me would involve Connolly and my wife experiencing the same pain they inflicted on us. I authorized Ray to convey this message to both of them. Ray expressed his concern, acknowledging the potential fallout from the situation. He sought a resolution to mitigate the consequences. I responded by outlining the steps necessary for resolution, including Connolly publicly admitting to the affair and resigning as mayor. I emphasized that nothing less would prevent me from exposing him and seeking retribution. Ray expressed surprise at the seriousness of my intentions. I assured him of my resolve. Excusing myself, I mentioned needing to prepare dinner for my daughter. Stacy arrived from the garage, informing me that she had placed her mother's belongings by the curb, where they were picked up by an unfamiliar individual driving a black Mercedes. Ray joked about the possibility of the clothes ending up for sale at Goodwill, if not collected by the right person. I mentioned that I had packed Kathy's regular clothes, but hesitated to include her fancy nightgowns. I expressed my discomfort at the sight of some particularly provocative teddies she owned. Stacy acknowledged my concern with a nod. I advised her that she would eventually need to address the situation with Kathy, to which she responded that she would do so when the timing felt right. The weekend passed without further incident. Stacy assisted me with laundry while I focused on my plan to expose Mayor Connolly. On Monday morning, I contacted a friend at the local paper, John Foster, and arranged to meet him for coffee at Danny's. John, a former sergeant in my National Guard company, greeted me warmly. During our conversation, I provided John with some information regarding Mayor Connolly's affair with the wife of one of our soldiers during our deployment in Afghanistan. I refrained from disclosing the soldier's identity, emphasizing the sensitivity of the matter. I stressed that if I were in the soldier's position, I wouldn't want such betrayal to become public knowledge. I shared observations of Connolly's unfaithful interactions with the soldier's wife, leaving the decision of how to proceed with John. I informed John that contrary to rumors, the woman involved in the affair was not separated or going through a divorce. Her husband had only recently become aware of the situation. I acknowledged John's concern about making baseless accusations against the mayor and the risk of legal action. When asked about evidence of the affair, I presented the pictures and videos I had captured, though I requested that the woman's identity be partially obscured. John understood the implications and appeared uneasy. I expressed my resolve to John, acknowledging that although the truth would eventually surface, I was prepared to confront the shame. I explained that during Connolly's affair with my wife, I was overseas, unaware of the situation. I emphasized to John the betrayal inherent in taking advantage of a soldier's absence by engaging in infidelity with his spouse. John, understanding the gravity of the situation, offered to look into the matter further. After confirming that the affair had persisted throughout my deployment, I transferred the evidence to his cell phone. We briefly reminisced about fallen comrades from our company before parting ways with a handshake. I proceeded with the next step, which involved searching online for a reputable divorce lawyer. After reviewing references, I selected R.J. Collins, Esquire, and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Upon arriving at the office, I was surprised to find that R.J. stood for Revenge Joy, a woman in her 50s with a straightforward demeanor. She wasted no time in asking how she could assist me. I informed her of my need for a divorce, preemptively warning her that it would not be amicable due to my wife's affair with the town mayor during my deployment. She reacted with surprise, dropping the pen she had been holding. I confirmed to Joy that the mayor in question was indeed Connolly and proceeded to provide her with a detailed account of the situation, which she attentively listened to for the next half hour. She took notes throughout, occasionally pausing to seek clarification or ask questions. When I mentioned my daughter Stacy, Joy inquired about her feelings regarding the matter, to which I explained that she was deeply upset and reluctant to stay with her mother during my deployment. Considering Stacy's age and preferences, Joy suggested the possibility of having her stay with my mother instead. I agreed and decided to contact my mother to arrange it. Our discussion continued for nearly an hour. I provided Joy with an overview of our financial situation, and she advised me to discuss potential resolutions with my wife. I explained that witnessing the closeness between my wife and the mayor left no possibility for reconciliation, and I requested that she prepare the divorce papers promptly. Over the following week, Kathy contacted me 5 times, but I kept the conversations brief, promising to update her on the proceedings later. On Friday, Joy informed me that the divorce papers were prepared and required information about where they should be served. I informed Joy that I intended to invite Kathy to my home the following Monday at 2, while Stacy was at school, so she could be served with the divorce papers. I called Kathy's cell phone and arranged the meeting for Monday at 2 at the house. Kathy attempted to engage in conversation, seemingly prepared to explain her actions, but I cut her off, stating that she would have the opportunity to speak later. On Monday, Kathy arrived a few minutes early and we sat down at the kitchen table. Seeing her, I felt a pang of emotion. Despite the circumstances, she looked beautiful. I offered her coffee, but she declined, requesting only water. I acknowledged her desire to speak and assured her that she would have the chance to do so. However, I also informed her that someone would arrive shortly to serve her with the divorce papers. Her expression turned pale. I explained to Kathy that I didn't desire the situation either, just as I hadn't desired her affair with Donald Connolly. I indicated that it seemed neither of us would have things go our way. Kathy pleaded with me to listen to her explanation, expressing hope for a resolution. I agreed to hear her out. She recounted how she had worked on Donald's election campaign and developed a friendship with him during my deployment. Feeling lonely and depressed, she found solace in Donald's companionship. Kathy recalled attending a dinner event with Donald where he advised her to use her maiden name and leave her wedding rings at home to avoid gossip. She admitted that she hadn't thought much of it at the time but recognized now that removing her rings was a mistake. That night, Kathy recounted, she mingled with numerous people, all of whom perceived her as a single woman. When I inquired about when the affair began, Kathy admitted that it didn't start immediately but rather after a night of close dancing and a goodnight kiss when Donald dropped her off. She justified her actions by expressing her loneliness and the allure of being treated like royalty by someone prominent in the community. I confronted Kathy, questioning her decision to engage in such behavior while I was away at war. She acknowledged her wrongdoing and admitted to feeling confused and longing for my presence, despite my absence. She continued, explaining that Donald's company provided her with enjoyment and helped alleviate her feelings of loneliness. Kathy confessed to the increasing frequency of their outings, acknowledging the closeness that developed between them as the affair progressed. She confessed they began seeing each other 2 or 3 times a week. One evening, after a romantic dinner, Donald invited her back to his place, and despite her initial hesitation, she agreed. Kathy recounted feeling remorseful afterward and insisted that Donald take her home. After ending things with Donald and expressing her love for me, Kathy admitted to reconsidering her decision. Donald, she recounted sadly, had left her alone for some time before reaching out to express his longing for her companionship. He assured her that he missed her and wished to see her again, but only as friends. He apologized for their previous actions and promised not to put her in a compromising situation again. Despite her initial resolve, Kathy confessed that she agreed to see Donald again the following weekend. Kathy recounted that Donald took her to an intimate party at a friend's home on the Bluffs. She described it as a small gathering with only 5 or 6 couples, all of whom were influential individuals in the town. During the event, Kathy was caught off guard when the wife of a prominent doctor inquired about how she managed to capture Donald's attention. Unable to think of a suitable response, Kathy admitted to fabricating a story about being separated from her husband and going through a divorce. The news about Kathy's fabricated separation and impending divorce quickly spread throughout the small town, causing Kathy to feel trapped. During a weekend when our daughter Stacy was away, Kathy spent time with Donald at his home, leading to their ongoing relationship. Kathy expressed deep regret for the pain she caused me and Stacy, acknowledging that her actions were the worst mistake of her life and that she wished she could undo them. However, she admitted that undoing the damage was impossible. When asked about her feelings for Donald, Kathy admitted uncertainty about whether she loved him, but acknowledged enjoying their time together. Despite my probing questions about their closeness and the possibility of marriage, Kathy remained unsure about the future of their relationship. The doorbell rang, and I suggested that it might be for Kathy. She approached the door slowly and confirmed her identity when handed a manila envelope, which contained the divorce papers. Kathy stood at the door for a while, visibly upset, before closing it and turning to me, tears streaming down her face. She asked if our relationship was truly over, to which I affirmed. Despite her declaration of love, I countered that what she loved was the life we had, which she had discarded. I informed her that our daughter, Stacy, would stay with my mother until my deployment ended. Kathy broke down in tears, overwhelmed with regret. The following day, the front page of the local newspaper displayed a picture with a headline questioning the identity of a married woman leaving a hotel room with Mayor Connolly. The photo showed Kathy and the mayor kissing as they exited room 1114, accompanied by a caption questioning whether her husband, serving in Afghanistan, was aware of the situation. The article described the charity event attended by the pair and hotel records confirming the mayor's reservation of the room for the night. Additionally, the couple was photographed leaving the room at 2 in the morning. The article also mentioned unverified rumors of regular meetings over the past 6 months between the woman and the mayor while her husband was deployed in Afghanistan. The newspaper asserted its editorial right to bring the story to light, given the man's stature and the offense against a soldier stationed in harm's way. This caused significant uproar within minutes of the story reaching people's doorsteps. The mayor's office entered damage control, asserting the story was entirely fabricated. They claimed Mayor Connolly would never jeopardize any marriage, especially that of a soldier serving his country overseas. They contended that the photograph was an obvious fake, attributing the situation to unnamed sinister individuals targeting the mayor. A promised press conference later that afternoon aimed to set the record straight. Fortunately, over the past 6 months, too many people had seen Connolly and Kathy together displaying affection in public. One by one, his friends and supporters began distancing themselves. Several people anonymously phoned the newspaper to confess they knew for a fact that the couple had been having an affair because they'd witnessed it on more than one occasion, expressing outrage at discovering that the woman's husband was deployed in the army while the affair was taking place. That afternoon, Mayor Connolly held his news conference, but none of his friends on the city council stood by him. In fact, the only people backing him up were his staff, and even half of them were strangely missing. The newspaper and TV stations were present, recording the entire event as Connolly expressed horror at being accused of such an unthinkable thing. He assured everyone that he and the woman were merely acquaintances and had never done anything to bring shame upon them or the woman's husband. Halfway through his speech, Kathy pushed her way through the onlookers and reached the microphone. In an act of defiance, Kathy revealed her identity, stating, "My name is Kathy Crawford. I am the wife of Army Major Robert Crawford, and for the past 6 months, I've been having an affair with Mayor Connolly." Connolly tried to dismiss her, claiming he didn't know her and calling her a liar. Kathy confronted him, expressing shame and heartbreak, accusing him of pursuing her despite knowing she was married and that her husband was in Afghanistan. Tearfully, she apologized to her husband through the TV cameras and left, while reporters bombarded the mayor with questions. He turned and stormed back into City Hall. "I must confess that exposing all of that to the world damaged my already fragile ego. However, I was aware of the risk I was taking when I approached John Foster, my newspaper contact. The next day this occurred, the president of the city council announced the mayor's resignation and declared that the council would govern the city until a new mayoral election could be held. While I should have felt satisfaction, all I experienced was a profound, empty loneliness. Loneliness consumed me, and I missed my wife more than I had ever thought possible." That afternoon, my reporter friend called to inform me that Connolly had packed up and left town without leaving a forwarding address, and my soon-to-be ex-wife hadn't accompanied him. During the remaining days of my leave, I spent as much time as possible with my daughter. In the last week, I allowed Kathy to move back into the house. Stacy and I traveled to my mother's home, 60 miles away, where I enrolled her in school, promising to return and get her as soon as my deployment was over. The following week, I was on a plane back to Afghanistan, my heart filled with burning anger that I intended to unleash on the enemy lurking in the desert. What happened to Kathy? A few weeks later, she moved in with Connolly, and they too departed from town. Did Robert return from Afghanistan? Yes, but he suffered critical injuries, and his daughter assisted him in getting back on his feet. He lost one of his legs in an ambush. Currently, he works as a design specialist for a large electronics firm residing with his daughter. Occasionally, he speaks about the challenges faced by soldiers who have served duty outside.
Story 2.
I reflected on the recent weeks, struggling to pinpoint any specific evidence that would suggest she was cheating. The sense of unease within me resulted from various small incidents accumulating, leaving me with an unsettling feeling. While I sensed something was amiss, I couldn't identify it precisely. Although I was fairly certain that something was happening, I lacked proof and details regarding who, what, or where it might be occurring. Doubts about my own sanity surfaced, questioning whether I was overreacting or imagining scenarios of her infidelity. Despite my uncertainty, my gut was in turmoil, indicating that something indeed was going on. It could be the early stages of a fling or affair, perhaps a one-time occurrence. Strangely, the more I dwelled on these thoughts, the more convinced I became. I had been grappling with these concerns for what felt like weeks, but how long had the situation been unfolding before I became slightly aware that something was wrong. I took another sip of my JD, signaling the bartender, who nodded with a half smile, having seen that troubled look many times before. Surveying the quiet bar, filled with indistinct chatter, I noticed a lack of joy. The patrons had bland, unremarkable faces, all nondescript and average. The only woman in the place, in her 40s, possibly overdressed for the time and place, seemed a bit desperate, receiving drinks from an older guy. He appeared hopeful, though looking at her, he didn't need to try so hard. She already had his number. Other patrons were merely passing time while the rain outside fell, further dampening spirits. Soon, each would run out of reasons to stay in the sanctity of the bar and head homeward. I remained undecided about my course of action. I turned towards the voice, and there she was, looking at me with eyes that seemed to peer into my soul. As I attempted to respond, words eluded me. In the dimly lit bar, water dripping from her, Sammy started to remove her coat, and I questioned her presence. Curious, I asked why she was here. Sammy explained that she was worried about me, sensing that she would find me at the bar. She suggested we talk. I stared at her, wondering about her motives. Could I trust her? To steady myself, I took a sip of my JD and ordered her a vodka and soda. We waited for the bartender to move away before resuming our conversation, our eyes conveying uncertainty and a subtle struggle for dominance. Sammy pointed out that my recent behavior had caught her attention, sensing that I carried the weight of the world on my shoulders. I looked into her brown eyes but quickly averted my gaze. There was an unspoken understanding between us. I assured her that everything was okay between us, attempting to downplay the situation. However, she wasn't convinced. My heart sank as I realized my attempts to minimize the issue were futile. Placing her glass on the tab, Sammy locked her fingers together, leaning slightly forward. She told me she knew what was going on. Confused, I feigned ignorance, but Sammy insisted we move to a booth for privacy. Reluctantly agreeing, I asked her what she thought she knew, attempting to deflect the conversation. Sammy saw through my bluff, asserting that I couldn't lie to her after our long history. She encouraged me to talk, insisting that I needed someone to confide in. Update: I'd known Sammy since she was 17. She was a constant presence and harbored a crush on me when I initially dated her sister Claire, who was 3 years older. Despite their differences, Sammy and I always got along, occasionally leading to sibling clashes with Claire over the years. Claire and I married after 2 years and settled into what I perceived as an ideal future. Both working in decent jobs, we earned enough for a comfortable life. Sammy, my sister-in-law, had enjoyed her late teens and early 20s, and at 25 sought a more mature phase in life. She had matured into someone any guy would be fortunate to be close to. Claire and I had been married for 5 years, with our anniversary due in another month, contemplating whether we would make it that far. Sammy, an attractive woman and a friend besides my sister-in-law, looked at me with my eyes filling, struggling to articulate my emotions while her resounding "I know" echoed in my mind. Sammy reached across the table, offering support as her fingers gently stroked mine. I felt my heart slowly breaking as she spoke. She mentioned that if I wouldn't say it, she would. She believed she knew that she was cheating on me. Despite the shock of her words, I stubbornly tried to process what I knew and its implications. I resisted hearing more, convincing myself that if I didn't acknowledge it, it couldn't be happening, sparing me from the pain of confronting the truth. Sammy noticed my glassy-eyed expression and questioned whether it was shock or denial. She expressed her love for me and urged me to wake up, suggesting that it might be a misunderstanding. In response, I attempted to deflect her and continued deceiving myself. Sammy's eyes flashed with rage, and she exclaimed, drawing the bartender's attention. I assured the bartender that everything was fine. Sammy apologized, expressing her frustration with me and emphasizing her concern for my well-being. She urged me to wise up and face the reality of the situation, emphasizing that we needed to take action. I agreed to start, and Sammy shared her suspicions. She recounted an incident from a few weeks ago when she was with my partner and she received a call on her mobile. Sammy found it peculiar that she left the room to take the call, considering they were sisters. I nodded, feeling a sense of dread. Continuing her story, Sammy revealed that she checked my partner's phone, discovering there was no lock code. The call was from a guy saved as Robert. Sammy didn't know any Robert or Bob, but decided to monitor for any recurrence. I asked about the identity of this Robert or Bob guy, seeking clarification. After about a week, Sammy discovered the identity of the guy my partner had been messaging. He was someone she knew from years ago, before our relationship began. Apparently, they reconnected through social media or chat sites, and their messaging had been going on for a few weeks. I admitted that I had no knowledge of these interactions, only sensing that there were small things keeping us apart. Sammy acknowledged this, but explained that it was all part of what they were doing, nothing overt, but it seemed like things were falling into place for them. Curious, I asked if it was just a couple of friends messaging each other, perhaps reminiscing about old times. Sammy confirmed that it started that way, but hinted that something had changed. I was surprised and asked if I hadn't noticed anything suspicious. I mentioned that it felt like circumstances were conspiring to keep us apart, and there was an obvious lack of opportunity for any fun, too. Sammy stared at me incredulously, expressing a sense of disbelief. I returned her gaze, awaiting her next words. She urged me to pull my head out of the metaphorical sand, emphasizing her love for me. In response, I questioned the extent of the situation, seeking to understand how far it had gone. Sammy met my gaze, and her eyes briefly flickered, providing an unspoken confirmation. My anger began to simmer within me, prompting a quick barrage of questions about when, how, and where these encounters had taken place. Sammy shared that she knew my partner had met the other guy at least 3 times over the past 2 weeks. Initially unsure, Sammy only became certain 2 days ago that the situation had progressed. She had a lunch with one of her friends who worked with Claire, and some information slipped out during their conversation. Sammy discovered that Claire had met the guy twice for lunch, and at least once for dinner the previous week. She asked if this aligned with what I had observed or suspected. I looked at her as I took in her words. There were a couple of times recently when I had called her office to arrange a lunchtime meet, and she wasn't there or had just gone out. Was that when she met him? Then last week she had that seminar thing she just had to attend. It was a late notice thing and arranged for after work. She had gotten home late that night, after 12. Thinking back, she had come in saying that it had dragged on, and the team had gone for a drink in the hotel bar to unwind before leaving. No lovemaking that night, I remember, and she hit the shower before bed, too. My mind was racing. My brain scrambled as I took in these hurtful facts. Sammy expressed concern, telling me not to do anything reckless that could lead to legal trouble. I could sense the change in her expression as I made my decision. I declared my refusal to tolerate the situation any longer and vowed to put an end to it. I affirmed that I would not accept a cheating partner and was determined to make them both pay for their actions. Sammy cautioned me, advising against impulsive actions without a plan. Her words had a strange way of helping me calm down, confirming that my suspicions were indeed true. Seeking more information, I asked if she knew where my partner might be at that moment. Sammy confirmed that she believed my partner was currently with the other guy, explaining that it was the reason she sought me out. The rage resurfaced, prompting me to pound the table. People in the bar turned to look as I signaled the bartender. I asked Sammy if she knew the exact location. Sammy explained that she didn't know the exact location, but planned to speak with my partner the next day to gather more information. She mentioned that the other guy is married with a couple of kids, though she wasn't sure about his residence. She assured me that she would try to find out more to assist in the situation. I expressed gratitude, reaching for her hand and holding it tightly as I wiped away a tear from her cheek. I thanked her for her support, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation for her. Sammy, looking worried, asked about my plans. I assured her that I couldn't act on my impulses just yet, but intended to put an end to the situation definitively. I promised there would be consequences, without remorse, for both of them. In the meantime, I planned to secure what was rightfully mine and gather evidence for my next course of action. As I finished my JD, I signaled the bartender, slipping him a note and telling him to keep the change. Sammy continued to look concerned and asked when I planned to confront my partner. I considered the situation, planning to make some calls the next day while addressing my assets. I emphasized my determination not to give her a single penny. Sammy pointed out the difficulty of being around my partner, and I acknowledged that it had been challenging for the past few weeks. I believed that if she hadn't noticed any change by now, she likely wouldn't in the future. Sammy stood up, expressing her need to leave. I offered to talk again tomorrow and she agreed, promising to find out more for me. She put on her coat and I stood to help her, feeling her proximity. She resembled her sister so much. As she looked up at me, tears in her eyes, I kissed her cheek, reassuring her that I would be fine. She smiled and left, disappearing into the dark and wet evening. Sitting back down, I took a deep breath, contemplating my next steps. One thing was clear in my mind: they would pay, and the retaliation would be swift, relentless, and unforgiving. Update. I don't recall much after that. Somehow, I woke up in my own bed with a mouth like the bottom of a parrot's cage. My head was still swimming as I raised it off the bed. Rolling over, I noticed I was alone, and there was no sign of Claire. My senses slowly awakened as I heard noises from downstairs. Sliding my feet over the side of the bed, I tried to stand. Waking up the next morning, I couldn't help but wonder about the events of the previous night. As I staggered to the bathroom, attempting to shake off the grogginess, I proceeded to rouse myself. Entering the kitchen, I found her there, inquiring about the state I was in. In response to her question, I vaguely mentioned having a drink with an old friend and getting carried away. Sitting down, I poured some orange juice, drank it, and poured another. When she probed further, asking about the friend's identity, my mind started to work. I mentioned a guy named Bob, explaining that I knew him from way back, and he was in town for a couple of days on business. At the mention of Bob, I noticed a flicker of something on her face as she turned. I elaborated, recalling our college days and football years together. Claire seemed puzzled, unable to remember Bob. Nevertheless, she brushed it off, expressing indifference as long as I had fun. It was the first warning sign. Seated across from me at the table, I thought about my conversation with Sammy the previous night. I casually inquired about her activities the night before, feigning interest. I looked into her eyes as she lied about finishing work and going for a light meal and a drink with colleagues. She claimed to be home by 9:30, expressing concern for me due to a late meeting. I knew she wasn't home by then, as I was still at home until 10 p.m., deciding to head to the bar when enough was enough. That was the second warning sign. She continued, mentioning some tasks she needed to complete in the morning and hinting at being late in the evening. Bob, an old friend, was expected to be in touch, and they had plans to catch up. I suggested inviting Bob over, emphasizing the pleasure of reconnecting with old friends. She agreed and asked if I remembered him, using an endearing term. She stared at me with a neutral expression, attempting to conceal any reaction, but I sensed something beneath the surface. Despite her poker face, I could perceive a hint of emotion. I dismissed her inquiry about inviting Bob over, assuring her that I would manage on my own. I decided to get ready for the day, having more orange juice and a couple of painkillers before leaving the house, ensuring I didn't miss the opportunity to collect my car left at the bar. 30 minutes later, I departed while Claire continued preparing for her day. As I dressed, I contemplated the situation, my determination growing. This couldn't continue for much longer. I clenched my fists, angered by the thought of Claire with Bob. Vowing revenge, I harbored intense resentment towards him. The workday proved chaotic, with a constant stream of calls dealing with issues on the line. My secretary handled some calls, but I couldn't avoid crucial meetings. The tension within me intensified as I navigated through the day, fueled by a growing desire for retribution. By mid-morning, the initial rush eased off, and I had some almost free time to deal with my personal issues. I closed my office door and started to check out my financials. Within 15 minutes, I had tightened the purse strings and moved some cash out of reach. I also arranged a meeting with a solicitor to discuss a possible divorce. I still had a few days before that, so my thinking was that it would give me time to get more information. Not that it would matter that much anyway, but it could give me some leverage. Claire had her own bank account and credit card, so there was no need to do anything there. It was access to our joint account that was of concern, but I plugged that loophole quickly, so if it came to it, she couldn't get any more than what was left. My own account was secure and only had a smallish balance. The rest was shifted out and safe. We had no children, So essentially, it would be a straightforward split should it come to that. I had decided in my own mind that we could only get over this if Claire were to confess her sins, so to speak, and seek forgiveness. Any kind of reticence there, and we were done. That thought made me feel sad. I sat at my desk in silence as I mulled over what had transpired and the actions I had taken so far today. I needed more information on the Bob character and evidence, or would the fact that I knew about it be enough to really duck the two of them over? The phone interrupted my thoughts, and it was Sammy on the line. I shared that I was occupied with various thoughts and plans, but had initiated some actions. Sammy provided additional information about the guy, Bob Stones, revealing that he was married. She had his address and workplace, obtained discreetly through her friend who had seen Claire with him. According to Sammy, they seemed to be growing closer, despite attempts to conceal it. Acknowledging the start of potential evidence, I requested Bob's details from Sammy. Within minutes, I located his social media page and obtained a photo. Something about his face seemed familiar, triggering a vague memory. Despite the unsettling feeling, I decided to call Claire around lunchtime, intending to stir the container. During the call, Claire explained she had a meeting with a client named Mr. Stones, which added another layer to the situation. Suppressing my emotions, I kept the conversation casual, though her mention of Mr. Stones felt like a taunt. Strike three, I thought, determined to take swift and merciless action against both of them. Ending the call, I masked my anger, promising to see her later and enduring her declaration of love with a clenched jaw. After ending the call, my anger boiled within me. Seated there, I clenched my teeth, contemplating the unsettling revelation. My secretary appeared, poking her head into the office, offering to grab something from the deli down the street. Considering for a moment, I instructed her to surprise me with something substantial, hearty, and rich in red meat, something to sink my teeth into. She gave me a peculiar look, but nodded, closing the door behind her. Sensing that my behavior had been unusual all morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. Sammy visited her sister's office and noticed Claire leaving the elevator alongside a tall, dark-haired man, roughly around 30 years old, Bob Stones, the man Sammy had identified from his online photo. Stepping in front of her sister, Sammy surprised Claire, who seemed uneasy about her plans being disrupted. Sammy explained her impromptu visit, expressing a desire to see her sister and possibly go for lunch. Claire, visibly uncomfortable, mentioned that she and Mr. Stones were having a business lunch and suggested meeting another time. Mr. Stones introduced himself, and Sammy, feigning innocence, asked how long he had known Claire. The question seemed to catch him off guard, and Claire hurriedly pulled him away, citing a meeting they needed to attend. As they left the building and entered a waiting cab, Sammy smiled, observing her sister looking back at her as they drove away. I sat in my office, munching through a massive sub filled with red meat, smiling to myself as I gnawed at it slowly, savoring it while contemplating my next steps. Sammy had confirmed that Claire had left her office, so she called her secretary and found out she would be out all afternoon. Well, isn't that just ducking great? Everything was set regarding my finances, and I had a locksmith on speed dial with the terms pre-arranged. My solicitor was primed and ready to act as soon as I provided him with the remaining information he had requested. Okay, tonight was going to be the first stage. I was going to really mess with the pair of them for a little while before I pulled the trigger. My old man always told me, don't let them know you're coming for them. Just take Route 1, be direct, and destroy the Basts. A man of few, if not direct, words. Maybe that was something I had forgotten recently, but it was coming. It was on its way. Update. That evening at home, Claire walked in appearing normal, and nothing seemed out of place until I detected a faint scent of men's cologne as I went to kiss her. She noticed my reaction, and without verbalizing anything, I gave her a light kiss on the cheek and made my way to the door. Curious, she inquired about my plans, asking if everything was okay. I assured her that I was fine, but had a matter to attend to. I explained that I was heading to Jerry's place for a poker game with a few colleagues from work, hoping it would be a good distraction. Closing the door behind me, I got into my car and left the driveway, grinding my teeth in frustration. Upon arriving at Jerry's, I parked outside and entered his garage. Jerry, a longtime friend with a history of dealing with the police, had combat training, making him the ideal companion for what I had in mind. He was a substantial figure, a friend since school, and I had called him earlier to seek his assistance, and he readily offered his support without asking questions. This kind of unwavering support was exactly what I needed. We quickly slipped into the garage, and I changed into a pair of dark overalls with a matching ski mask. We looked like two mime artists standing in silence. No words were exchanged as we got into a nondescript second-hand car Jerry had obtained. Nothing remarkable or noticeable about it. Cruising slowly across town to the address Sammy had given me, still no words passed between us. We had agreed on the format before, so there was no need for further discussion. Jerry parked the car outside Bob Stone's home, and there was no sign of life with just one visible light. We waited in silence. As the front door opened, we saw him step out, get into his car, and ease down the road. Jerry followed at a safe distance. We already knew his destination, so there was no rush or panic. Parking at the driving range posed no problem, and we stayed in the car. The radio played in the background as we sat, watching and waiting. The tension inside me was almost unbearable, making it challenging to stay still. The urge to step out and walk around was strong, but we knew it was risky. Gradually, the car park emptied until only a couple of other cars remained. Both of us tensed as we observed him making his way to his car. Jerry got out and stealthily approached the target. Afterwards, I drove us out of the car park quietly, without drawing attention. Jerry remarked on the success of the operation as he removed his gloves and mask. I expressed gratitude, acknowledging that I appreciated his assistance. Jerry assured me not to worry, stating that he owed me and could never fully repay me for what I had done for him. I reminded him that friends help each other, and pointed out that at least his hands weren't injured and there was no CCTV in the car park. We considered the job well done. Deciding to head back, Jerry suggested starting a card game with the others who would be there by now. We drove back, spending the next 4 hours playing poker for fun. The atmosphere among the guys was positive, and they understood the situation, providing the support I needed, boosting my confidence for the upcoming confrontation with Claire. However, before addressing the main issue, I planned to play some mind games with her. I stumbled through the door just after 1 a.m., intentionally exaggerating the amount I had to drink. Jerry had arranged for one of the guys to drop off my car. Claire, waiting up, questioned my lateness and examined me closely. I dismissed her concern, mentioning that Jerry and the guys had dropped me off in my car, admitting to having a bit too much JD. Disregarding my jacket and missing the coat pegs, I slumped onto the sofa and looked at her. Claire, with crossed arms and a disgusted expression, sat there. I maintained a blank expression, waiting for her to speak. She couldn't hold back and finally asked, "What is going on, Steve? Is there someone else or something? You're acting really weird lately." I chuckled, suppressing the anger building within me, reminding myself to take it easy. "I'm all right, my petal. Just been through a rough patch recently. It'll all be over soon." My words lingered in Claire's mind, leaving her unsure but sensing something amiss. We went to bed, and I pretended to collapse, feigning immediate sleep. It irked her, as she seemed ready for a confrontation, but I refused to engage. The following morning, Claire was the first to rise, making coffee. I descended the stairs, acting obnoxious, pretending to have a hangover. Playfully entering the kitchen, I greeted her and mentioned my throbbing head. She tossed a headache remedy my way as I sipped my coffee. She appeared subdued, and I noticed her phone on the kitchen table, wondering if she had received any calls. Claire noticed my gaze on her phone, and I could sense her desire to reach for it, although doing so would seem odd. Pouring more orange juice, I casually picked up the phone. A look of panic flashed across her face as I had intercepted a message. I briefly glanced at it before sliding the phone back to her, stating that it needed charging to avoid a flat battery and any missed messages. Leaving the kitchen, I went to get dressed, leaving Claire looking after me with a sense that something was amiss. She wondered if I could know, dismissing the thought as she believed she had been careful. Their involvement had only been going on for a few weeks. Lunches, dinner 3 times, and hotel stays 3 times. She considered it nothing more than fun, confident that Steve would never find out, especially since he wasn't going without. The revelation led her to contemplate her recent intimacy with her husband, unable to recall the last time. She pondered if her neglect might have contributed to Steve's suspicions. Hastily descending the stairs, I swiftly exited the door, sidestepping Claire's attempt for a more passionate farewell. Waving and smiling, I pulled out of the driveway and headed to work. Around 11 a.m., I decided to send Claire a text for amusement, expressing regrets for the day and explaining that there was a lot on my mind, assuring her it would soon be resolved. I settled back, awaiting a reaction. Later in the day, Sammy visited me, inquiring about what had happened. I questioned Sammy about her earlier statement, asking her what she meant. Earlier in the day, an employee from the golf club had found Bob Stones in the trunk of his car, badly beaten. Claire had informed Sammy, and she was shaken. Sammy asked if I had done it, and I responded that I didn't care too much either way, denying any involvement. I went on to mention that Claire had told me she found out about Bob's condition through a scheduled meeting with him. His company had called, stating he was in the hospital, and his wife had called them. Sammy found my explanation cute and plausible, but suggested that maybe next time it wouldn't be so easy for them. I was asked about my cryptic remark, and I replied, saying that accidents happen in the strangest places. That night, upon arriving home, Claire was absent, and her car was gone. There was no message. Irritated, I called her phone, cheerfully inquiring about her whereabouts. She responded, explaining that she was at the hospital visiting a friend, assuring me it wouldn't be long. I expressed my hope for her friend's swift recovery, bid her goodbye, and hung up before she could respond. 30 minutes later, she returned, looking drained. I asked about her friend's condition, expressing my hope that it wasn't too serious. Claire hesitated before responding, mentioning that it was nothing too dramatic. Her friend had just fallen and would be home in a few days. I suggested coffee, and she accepted, thanking me. While sipping her coffee, Claire brought up an incident at her workplace, mentioning that one of her company's reps had been assaulted the other night. I reacted with surprise, asking for details. She explained that he was attacked and left in his car overnight, but reassured me that he was okay. Bob wasn't hurt too badly, and it seemed like they wanted to mess him up for no reason. Nothing was stolen or anything. I couldn't help but think about the contradiction, given my prior denial of knowing Bob. Update. She noticed me looking at her and realized she had made a mistake. She tried to cover it up, but she knew it was too late. Now, I was aware of the situation as well. Quickly, she hurried to make an exit to change. I suspected she would be on the phone any second, but to whom? I decided I needed to reassess my plan since things were escalating. I had to move things forward a bit. Calling upstairs to Claire, I informed her I needed to go out for a little while, reassuring her I wouldn't be long. I drove to Bob Stones' home address and knocked on the door. A petite, dark-haired woman opened the door. I explained that I was Steve Ryland, and my wife, Claire Ryland, had dealings with her husband. She looked at me nervously, yet intrigued. I requested to come in for a moment. In the lounge, she realized the gravity of the situation as I mentioned the affair between Claire and her husband. I expressed my regret for having to break the news and informed her that he was currently in the hospital. She folded inwardly, tears flowing for a few seconds. Expressing her suspicions, she mentioned that she knew he was at it again and decided to divorce Claire. She felt that Claire had enough chances to come clean, and the lies were unbearable. Unsure of how long the affair had been going on, she was convinced of Claire's betrayal. When I inquired about the incident the other night, she admitted uncertainty. I clarified that I didn't lay a finger on him and expressed my shock at the situation. Indicating my lack of concern about whoever damaged him, I mentioned that I couldn't be sorry about it. I questioned if he might have been involved with another man's wife, to which she responded, "Nothing surprises me." She decided to keep him out of her life, emphasizing that they had moved back to the area because he was fooling around. Before leaving, I provided her with my locksmith's and solicitor's contact information, realizing the complexity of the situation. As I drove slowly home, I focused on dealing with the other half of my problem. My inner rage was under control, understanding that once retribution began, it would run its course, a course of action I would follow and relish for the most part. The end of my marriage saddened me, but I knew there was no going back from her betrayal. My one consolation was that the parties that caused me pain would experience it in far greater measure. I do not forgive. Update. I guided my car onto the driveway, noticing Claire's car exactly where she had left it just a couple of hours ago. Absent-mindedly tapping the bonnet as I passed, I approached my front door and slid my key into the lock. A heavy feeling settled in my heart, realizing this might be the last time I do this as a married man. Stepping inside, the weight of the recent worries pressed on my shoulders, making them incredibly heavy as I slowly moved towards the lounge. The murmur of the television greeted me as I neared the doorway. There, perched on the sofa, was Claire, her demeanor radiating fear and trepidation. A sense that something was amiss hung in the air, as if the game was up without a word being spoken. Nervously, she shook, trying to maintain composure. I stood, silently watching her, and as our eyes met, I saw fear and an attempt to speak, but nothing escaped her lips. Walking into the room, I passed her to fix myself a drink. Remaining silent, I reached for my drink, my unblinking eyes locked onto hers. She waited, sensing something was amiss. My expression remained impassive as I observed the woman I had deeply loved, now balancing those feelings with the pain she had needlessly caused me. It was time for her to feel my pain. As I stared, she detected no reason for optimism in my face. Pulling herself together, Claire straightened up, deciding to brazen it out. Unaware of what I knew, she couldn't endure the incriminating silence any longer. She asked where I had been, and frustration crept into her voice at my silent treatment. I responded, saying that I would tell her where I went if she told me where she had been. Uncertainty flickered in her eyes as she insisted she was at the hospital visiting a friend. I maintained a blank expression, and fear flashed across her eyes. She was rattled. Once again, she deflected the question back to me, thinking she had skillfully batted it away. I told her to stop the nonsense and explained that I'd visited a friend myself, someone I hadn't known for long. Our conversation was crucial, and although I hadn't met her before, we were now friends of sorts. I had an enlightening talk with her about her husband, Bob Stones, asking if she had heard of him. Her face flushed as I toyed with her emotions. I explained that I needed to talk to the Stones woman about her husband's infidelity, having discovered his affair. In response to my revelation, she offered concern, asking if I was okay and offering to get me a drink. I inquired about her knowledge of Bob Stone's affairs, watching her struggle to find words. I took the lead, telling her that I knew about her involvement with Bob and had known for a while. I challenged her to speak up before leaving, emphasizing that it didn't mean anything and was just closeness. I scoffed at her excuses, reminding her of the vows we both took. As she continued to defend herself, I called her out, expressing my frustration with her lies. I pointed out that she treated me like a fool, and her attempts to downplay the affair infuriated me. I sarcastically commented on the claim that it only happened twice, and questioned whether it was worth our marriage. She apologized, claiming it didn't mean anything and expressing a willingness to make it up to me. I laughed bitterly, accusing her of being sorry for getting caught and questioning whether she would have stopped if not exposed. I asserted that all the lies she told became second nature, and only she believed them. I told her that she was not the woman I fell in love with and married, and she looked at me as the weight of my hurt started to penetrate her cheater's facade. She realized the seriousness of the situation, and she asked what she could do, promising to do anything. I informed her that we were done, and called Sammy, letting her know about the situation. Sammy would be arriving shortly to pick her up. Claire, shocked, asked where she would go, and I responded harshly, saying she could go wherever she liked, even back to the hospital to see her boyfriend. I didn't care. We were done. Claire sat stunned as there was a knock on the door. I greeted Sammy and told her to get Claire out of here. I explained that if she didn't leave, I was afraid of what I might do to her. Despite hating what she had done, I still cared about her, but it was time for her to go. Sammy hurriedly gathered Claire's things for the next few days. I thanked Sammy for her assistance and mentioned that I would be in contact soon. As Sammy prepared Claire to leave, I listened to the sound of my wife sobbing. Sammy swiftly packed Claire's belongings into a couple of suitcases, and in less than 10 minutes, she was removed from my home. The real challenge would be to get her out of my life permanently and erase the pain. Retribution would help with that. Staring into the flames of the pyre I had built in the backyard, I watched everything of Claire's go up in flames. There was no way I would allow her back into my house for anything.
Story 3.
My mom announced to everyone at her wedding why I wasn't invited, blaming me for our family's issues and comparing me to my late father. Now I'm struggling with the fallout. Hi everyone, I'm Lindsay, 21, female, and I need some suggestions. So let's rewind a bit to where it all started. My parents' mom Marge, 46, female, and dad Sebastian, 48, male, were like the typical 80 couple. He was the laid-back guy who loved his music, and she was the go-getter who worked hard and wanted everything done yesterday. They met in college, fell in love, and before long, they had me. I was their first kid, and as far back as I can remember, there was always this kind of simmering tension between them. Dad was the kind of guy who had big dreams and aspirations, but was also prone to bouts of anxiety and depression. He was always a bit of a daydreamer, and while that's great in theory, it often left him feeling overwhelmed when things didn't go according to plan. He'd get these intense episodes where everything felt like it was closing in on him, and he'd just shut down. It was like watching someone drown in slow motion, and as a kid, I didn't really understand what was happening. Mom, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of energy. She was ambitious, driven, and had this almost unrelenting need for control. She was a natural organizer and wanted everything to be perfect, and that included our family life. Her patience for Dad's struggles was, let's say, pretty limited. Instead of offering support, she'd often make snide comments about how Dad was lazy or unmotivated, which obviously didn't help his mental health at all. I remember one time she said in front of me, "You know, if he spent as much time actually doing something as he does worrying about it, we'd probably have a yacht by now." It was awkward because I could see how much Dad was trying to keep it together. He'd put on this brave face, but you could tell he was hurting. And Mom's remarks, though maybe not meant to be cruel, felt like she was just pushing him further down. I guess in her defense, she had her own pressures and expectations, and she didn't know how to deal with Dad's issues in a constructive way. As a kid, I always felt like I was walking on eggshells around Mom. She had this critical streak that made me second-guess myself all the time. I'd bring home a report card with mostly A's and a single B, and she'd zero in on the B, saying things like, "Well, you could have done better if you actually tried." It wasn't that she didn't care, she did, but her way of showing it was often through criticism rather than encouragement. I think she thought she was motivating me, but it just ended up making me feel inadequate. So, growing up, I got this mixed message from both parents. Dad was this loving guy who could be incredibly supportive, but when he was down, he was really down. And Mom was always there pushing me to do better, but never quite satisfied. It felt like, no matter how hard I tried, I could never quite meet her expectations. The tension at home grew over the years, and the cracks in their relationship became more visible. Dad's mental health issues were always there, but they seemed to worsen as time went on. Mom's frustration with him only added to his stress, and it seemed like a vicious cycle. She would have these outbursts, and Dad would retreat further into his shell. Their arguments would get pretty intense, and I often found myself caught in the middle, trying to mediate or just stay out of the way. Eventually, things came to a head. I was about 14 when they finally decided to separate. I remember the day clearly. There was this huge fight that started with something small, like who was supposed to take out the trash, and it escalated into a full-blown screaming match. The house was tense, and I could feel the energy shift. After that, Mom sat me down and told me that they were getting a divorce. It was surreal. I'd heard them argue before, but hearing that they were separating felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Mom's reasons were always about Dad's inability to cope with life, and how his mental health issues were just too much for her to handle. Dad was devastated. He tried to put on a brave face, but it was clear how much it was hurting him. I tried to stay neutral, but I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and sadness. I was angry at Mom for her harshness and at Dad for not being able to fix things. But mostly, I felt lost. The separation wasn't easy. Mom moved out and found a new place, and Dad stayed in the house, which was both familiar and strangely empty without her. We did the whole back and forth thing for a while, which was emotionally draining. I spent weekends with Mom and the rest of the time with Dad. It felt like my world was split in two, and neither side felt like home anymore. Then, a few months after their separation, something happened that turned everything upside down. Dad committed suicide. It was a shock, to say the least. I don't know if you can ever really prepare for something like that. One minute you're trying to navigate a new normal, and the next, you're hit with the devastating news that someone you love is gone forever. It was a dark time. Dad's passing left a gaping hole in my life, and I was struggling to come to terms with it. I remember feeling a mix of anger and confusion. anger at him for leaving us, and confusion over how to deal with this overwhelming grief. Mom was obviously devastated too, but her way of coping was to try and maintain a semblance of normalcy. She threw herself into work and her social life, trying to keep busy to avoid dealing with the pain. Then, as if things weren't complicated enough, Mom started seeing someone new. It was a few months after Dad's death when she introduced her new boyfriend to me. At first, I was hopeful that this new relationship might bring some stability into her life. Maybe she'd find happiness again, and it would help us all move forward. However, she soon broke up with him. A few years ago, she started dating someone new. Mom was excited about this new relationship and wanted everything to be perfect. She started insisting that we all act a certain way in front of her new boyfriend. She wanted us to be this picture-perfect family, as if we'd all magically forget about Dad and his struggles. It was a lot of pressure. She'd constantly remind me to smile, to act happy, to be on my best behavior whenever her boyfriend was around. It felt like she was more concerned about making a good impression than actually dealing with the emotions we were all going through. I tried to go along with it for a while, but the facade was wearing thin. I was still grieving, and it felt like she was asking me to put on a mask and pretend everything was okay. One day, I finally snapped. I told her I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine and that her expectations were unrealistic given what we'd been through. I still had not forgiven her for how she treated my dad, and needed to be honest about my feelings and not have to hide them for the sake of appearances. Mom didn't take it well. She got really upset and told me I was being selfish and ungrateful. It was one of those moments where you realize that no matter how much you want to be understood, sometimes people just aren't ready or willing to listen. After that argument, things changed drastically. Mom started excluding me from family events and gatherings. It felt like she was punishing me for not playing along with the image she was trying to create. She'd still see me occasionally, but it was clear that our relationship was strained. It was like she had drawn a line in the sand, and I was on the wrong side of it. Things got even worse when I found out from my brother that Mom was engaged. It was a bit of a shock because I hadn't heard anything directly from her. We hadn't really been in touch much. Our conversations were sporadic and often awkward. I wasn't sure how to approach her, so I decided to reach out the best way I knew how. I sent her a congratulatory text. It was short and to the point. "Hey Mom, I heard about your engagement. Congratulations, I hope you're happy." I figured that was a nice gesture, just trying to be supportive and bridge the gap, even though it felt like we were miles apart. But here's the kicker. She didn't respond. Not a word. I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me felt hurt and confused, but I also knew that our relationship was rocky, and maybe she was just dealing with her own stuff. I tried to brush it off, but it lingered in the back of my mind. Then, my brother filled me in on something that completely knocked me for a loop. He told me that during the rehearsal dinner for Mom's wedding, she made a pretty big announcement. Apparently, she had talked about why I hadn't been invited to the wedding, and let me tell you, it was brutal. According to my brother, Mom had said in front of everyone, "The reason my name isn't here is because she's problematic, traumatic, and mentally unstable. Like father, like daughter." Those words cut deep. I was already struggling with my feelings about the whole situation, and hearing that Mom had labeled me so harshly in front of her new family and friends was a gut punch. It felt like she was publicly distancing herself from me and using me as a scapegoat for her own choices. It was like she was trying to make me the villain in her story, and I couldn't help but feel crushed by it. It was hard to process the fact that she was using my mental health struggles as a reason to justify not including me in her life. It was like everything I had been through, and the pain I had felt was being used against me. I felt invalidated and less important. Like my own struggles were being twisted to make her look better, or to fit a narrative she was trying to create. And that's when I started hatching a plan. I'd always been a bit of a hothead when it came to dealing with my emotions, and in my mind, this was a chance to make a statement. I knew it wasn't healthy or productive, but at that moment, it felt like the only way to make myself heard. My idea was to show up at Mom's wedding reception and make a dramatic statement. Here's the thing. I had access to something that might make an impact. After Dad died, I'd been going through his old things, trying to sort through his belongings and find some sense of connection. Among his stuff, I found a collection of diaries, and they weren't just random scribbles. They were detailed accounts of his life, his thoughts, and his struggles. I read through them, and it was eye-opening. Dad had written extensively about how Mom treated him poorly throughout their marriage, how she was critical and dismissive, and how it had affected him deeply. There were hundreds of pages detailing his emotional pain and the difficulties he faced. I wasn't sure what to do with these diaries at first. Part of me wanted to keep them as a way to remember Dad and honor his memory. But as I read through them and saw just how much he had endured, I felt this surge of anger. It seemed like an injustice that Mom was moving on so quickly and seemingly without any acknowledgement of the damage she had caused. I thought that maybe sharing some of Dad's own words might shed light on the reality of their relationship and make people see a different side of the story. So, I made the decision I was going to crash Mom's wedding reception and make a statement. I knew it was drastic, but I felt like I needed to do something to be heard. I wanted to confront the public facade she had built and let people see what was really going on behind closed doors. The day of the wedding arrived and I showed up at the venue. It was surreal walking into the reception hall, knowing that I was about to stir things up. I could see Mom and her new husband greeting guests, and everything looked like a scene straight out of a fairy tale. The decorations were beautiful, and everyone seemed to be having a great time. But for me, it was all just a mask for what I was about to reveal. I found a moment when there was a lull in the festivities. I waited until people were gathered around, and the mood was a bit relaxed. Then I grabbed the microphone. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I was determined. I cleared my throat and said, "Excuse me, everyone. I know this is a joyous occasion, but I need to say a few words." The room fell silent, and I could feel the eyes on me. I took a deep breath and began reading excerpts from Dad's diaries. I chose parts where he talked about his struggles with Mom's behavior and how he felt belittled and emotionally drained. I read about the harsh words she used, the demands she placed on him, and the deep emotional toll it had taken. It was about showing the reality behind their marriage. As I read, I could see the shock on people's faces. Some looked uncomfortable, others were visibly upset. Mom's face was a mixture of disbelief and anger. Her new husband looked bewildered, and I could see him trying to process what was happening. The room's atmosphere shifted from celebratory to tense and heavy. Mom eventually came up to the microphone and tried to stop me, but I wasn't done. I felt like I needed to finish what I started. I kept reading, trying to convey the depth of Dad's pain and how it had affected our family. I wanted people to understand that there was more to the story than what Mom had presented. After I finally finished, I handed the microphone back and walked out. I didn't stick around to see the aftermath. I knew I'd stirred up a lot of emotions, and I didn't want to be there for the fallout. I just needed to get away and process everything. In the days following, I was flooded with messages and calls. Some were from people who were sympathetic, others were from people who were angry or confused. Mom didn't reach out to me directly, but I heard through my brother and some mutual acquaintances that she was furious. She felt like I had completely disrespected her special day, and she was also deeply hurt by the public exposure of her past behavior. However, things were far from done. After the whole fiasco at Mom's wedding reception, I was mentally and emotionally drained. I felt like I'd made a mess of things, and I needed some space to figure out what to do next. So, I decided to block Mom's number and her social media accounts. I figured that if she needed to reach me, she'd find a way, but for now, I couldn't handle any more drama. A week went by, and I was trying to get back to some semblance of normalcy. I was deep into a new project at work and focusing on self-care. I wasn't expecting any news from Mom. If anything, I was bracing myself for a lot of anger and blame. So it came as a shock when my brother called me one afternoon, sounding a bit frazzled. "Hey, I don't know if you've heard, but Mom's marriage ended," he said, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was telling me. I was stunned. "Wait, what? Mark left Mom? How?" My brother didn't have all the details, but from what he gathered, it was pretty sudden. Apparently, Mark had moved out just a few months into their marriage. My brother didn't know the exact reasons behind the split, but he mentioned hearing some vague things about disagreements and mounting tensions. From what I could piece together, it sounded like things fell apart quickly, which made me wonder if Mom's new relationship was as ideal as she'd made it out to be. "Do you know if Mom's okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned despite everything that had happened. My brother wasn't sure. He said Mom was putting on a brave face and trying to act like everything was fine, but he could tell she was struggling. It was clear that she was in a tough spot, and it made me think about how much pain she might be in right now. Even though I was still hurt by how she treated me, I didn't want to see her suffering. After the call, I sat there for a while, trying to process the news. Part of me felt a sense of vindication, like maybe this was some kind of cosmic payback for everything that had happened. But another part of me felt a pang of sympathy. It was clear that Mom was dealing with a lot, and as much as I had been hurt by her actions, I knew what it was like to struggle with the fallout of failed relationships. I didn't reach out to Mom. It was a complicated mix of emotions. On one hand, I wanted to be there for her, but on the other hand, I didn't want to make things worse by bringing up old conflicts or reopening wounds. Plus, I wasn't sure how she'd react after everything that happened at the wedding. I was still blocked from her social media and didn't have her number unblocked yet. However, I didn't have to wonder for long. Last night, she showed up at my door completely unannounced and in a state that was far from ideal. I was in the middle of watching a movie when I heard banging on my front door. It was late, and my first thought was that it must be a mistake or a prank. But the knocking continued, and it quickly turned into a loud, persistent banging. I opened the door, and there she was, Mom, stumbling around, clearly drunk out of her mind. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes were rumpled, and she reeked of alcohol. I could smell the booze from a good 5 feet away. She was making a scene in the hallway, shouting and sobbing, her words coming out in a slurred mess. "Why do you do this to me? Why do you have to ruin everything?" she yelled, her voice echoing through the hallway. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. It was a far cry from the composed persona she tried to project during her wedding and subsequent marriage. I knew I couldn't just leave her out there, not only because she was creating a disturbance, but also because she looked like she needed help. I sighed and let her in, hoping she'd calm down once she was inside. I led her into the living room and tried to get her to sit down. "Mom, you need to calm down," I said, trying to keep my own frustration in check. "What's going on? Why are you so upset?" She ignored my questions and continued to rant, her accusations bouncing off the walls. "You ruined everything. I thought you were going to make things right, but all you did was make it worse. Mark left me because of you." The more she yelled, the more I realized how drunk she actually was. Her speech was incoherent, and she kept repeating the same phrases over and over. It was exhausting to listen to, but I tried to be patient. Despite everything that had happened, I couldn't ignore the fact that she was clearly in a lot of pain. Eventually, her yelling turned into slow, muffled sobbing. Her energy seemed to drain, and she sank to the floor, curling up like a child. Within minutes, she was passed out cold, snoring loudly on my living room carpet. I looked at her lying there, feeling a mix of emotions. Part of me was angry at the way she'd come to my home and treated me, and angry at the whole situation in general. Another part of me felt pity. Seeing her like this, so vulnerable and broken, was a harsh reminder that she was human too, and she was struggling in her own way. I decided it was best to just leave her where she was. I didn't have the emotional energy to deal with her right then. I grabbed a blanket from the closet, draped it over her, and then went to my bedroom and shut the door. I needed to get some sleep myself, and I couldn't handle any more of the drama at that moment. The next morning, I woke up to find that Mom was still there, sleeping soundly on my floor. I could hear her faintly stirring as I made my way to the kitchen. I wasn't sure how to handle the situation. Part of me wanted to just let her wake up on her own and figure things out, but I also knew that ignoring her wasn't really an option. I made some coffee and tried to gather my thoughts. I had no idea how she'd react when she woke up, whether she'd be embarrassed, angry, or even apologetic. I just hoped that maybe, after sleeping off the alcohol, she'd be more open to having a real conversation. However, by the time I got back to the living room after making coffee, she had already left. The blanket was still there, crumpled on the floor, and the remnants of her outburst were evident in the scattered tissues and empty coffee cup. I felt a pang of guilt as I looked around at the mess she'd left behind. It was clear that she had been in a rough place, and seeing her like that made me question whether I'd been too harsh with my dramatic entrance. At her wedding reception, in the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. I replayed the scene at the reception over and over in my head, questioning if I had crossed a line. Was it really fair of me to expose her personal struggles in such a public way? Sure, I felt she needed to understand the impact of her actions, but was there a better way to handle it? I would love to hear your suggestions. Update 1. Hi guys, some of you asked for what was in my dad's diary. I'm not going to share everything, but here are a few excerpts. Here's what he wrote. On March 12, 2005, she told me again that I'm weak and useless. She said she regrets ever marrying me. I don't know how much longer I can take this. June 18, 2007, she laughed at me when I told her about my anxiety attack. She said, I'm just looking for attention. I feel so alone. And here's one from December 24, 2008. Christmas is supposed to be a happy time, but all she does is criticize me. She said, I'm ruining the holidays for everyone. I just want to disappear. Reading these always breaks my heart. I hope that any one of you who is dealing with the same thing finds the strength to be better. Update 2. Hi guys, as per your suggestions, I did try reaching out to my mom, but she hasn't responded. It's been a few weeks since I sent her that letter, and I haven't heard a peep from her. I guess I shouldn't be too surprised given how things went down. I figured she might need some time and space. However, I did get some insight into what happened between my mom and Mark from my brother, and it's definitely adding another layer to this already complicated situation. So, my brother filled me in on some of the details about why Mark left mom so abruptly. Apparently, Mark has a younger brother who has been battling depression for quite some time. It's a tough situation, and it's clear that Mark's family has had their share of struggles. According to my brother, just a couple of days after the wedding, Mark's brother somehow found out that mom had been bad-mouthing him and making fun of his depression. Yeah, you heard that right. My mom apparently had a pretty cruel side that I hadn't seen before. Mark's brother had been struggling with his own mental health issues. And the fact that mom was making fun of him behind his back was a big deal. It wasn't just idle gossip, she was apparently really harsh and dismissive about his struggles, which is obviously a big red flag for anyone who's sensitive about mental health. When my brother told me this, I felt a mix of shock and understanding. On one hand, it was appalling to hear that my mom could be so callous about something as serious as someone's mental health. On the other hand, it also kind of made sense why Mark would be so quick to end the marriage if he found out that his new wife was being disrespectful and hurtful towards his own family. It's not exactly something you'd want to ignore. I was trying to make sense of all this when my brother suggested that we should try to find out more about Mark's brother and maybe reach out to him. He mentioned that it might be worth understanding how he was doing and if there was any way to make amends, or at least offer an apology on mom's behalf. It felt like a long shot, but I agreed that it might be a good idea to try and mend some of the bridges that had been burned. We managed to track down Mark's brother through some mutual connections, and after some careful consideration, I decided to reach out. I wanted to approach the situation delicately, knowing that he had every right to be angry and hurt. I sent him a message explaining who I was and acknowledging that I was aware of the situation. I apologized for what mom had said and done, even though I wasn't directly responsible. I also expressed my hope that he was getting the support he needed and that I genuinely wished him well. To my surprise, he responded. He was understandably cautious but appreciated the gesture. We had a few exchanges where he explained a bit more about how he was coping and how he had felt hurt by mom's comments. He also mentioned that he was in therapy and working on his mental health, which was a relief to hear. It was a small step towards making things right. And while I knew it wouldn't fix everything, it felt like a start. Update 3. Hi everyone, I know it's only been a few days since my last update, but things have taken more twists and turns, so here's the latest. My brother has been trying really hard to reach out to mom, hoping to patch things up or at least get some clarity on where things stand. Unfortunately, things haven't gone as smoothly as we'd hoped. A few days ago, my brother decided to make another attempt to see mom. He thought maybe some time had passed and she might be more open to talking things through. He showed up at her place, hoping to have a calm conversation and maybe start rebuilding some bridges. But when he arrived, she refused to even let him in. She slammed the door in his face, and from what he described, it was pretty harsh. It felt like a punch in the gut, especially since he was only trying to be there for her and figure out a way forward. That wasn't the end of it, though. A couple of days later, my brother tried to check in again, thinking that maybe things had cooled down a bit. He knocked on her door and tried calling her, but she wasn't answering. It was really unlike her to be so unreachable, especially considering she's usually pretty responsive. After a lot of calls and searching, he eventually discovered that mom had left town to visit her sister. Mom had apparently told my brother to stop bothering her and to leave her alone. She made it clear that she didn't want to talk to him, or by extension, to anyone from our side of the family. It was a tough blow, and I felt a pang of sympathy for my brother. He was just trying to reach out and maybe mend things, but it seemed like mom was shutting everyone out entirely. Hearing this news left me feeling conflicted. On one hand, I understood that mom was probably overwhelmed and struggling with her own emotions. It must be incredibly hard for her to face everything that's happened and to deal with the fallout of her actions. On the other hand, it was frustrating and disheartening to see her isolating herself and refusing to address the issues. It felt like she was avoiding the very conversations that needed to happen for any kind of healing to occur. My brother and I talked about it, and he shared how disheartened he felt. He genuinely wanted to help and offer support, but mom's refusal to engage made him feel like his efforts were in vain. It's hard when you're trying to reach out to someone, and they just push you away. He mentioned that he was considering giving her more space for now, hoping that maybe she'd come around when she was ready. But it's a tough call, and he's unsure of the best approach.
Story 4.
Michael cherished the stability of his life, his accounting job, quiet family dinners, and weekend traditions with his wife Rachel. For over 2 decades, they built a routine that felt secure and unshakable, centered around their daughter Emily. When Emily left for college, Michael assumed their growing distance was a natural adjustment to an empty nest. Unbeknownst to him, Rachel saw their stability as stagnation. While Michael found comfort in routine, Rachel grew restless, yearning for excitement and fulfillment beyond the walls of their home. What Michael viewed as a phase was, for Rachel, the start of a slow unraveling. Michael Carter found himself subjected to an experience no spouse should endure. He unintentionally eavesdropped on a conversation where 2 men spoke loudly about his wife in a manner that was both graphic and appallingly detailed. They weren't making vague remarks but were sharing explicit comparisons of their personal encounters with her. The vulgar descriptions bore no resemblance to the woman he had been married to for 21 years, let alone the mother of his child. At first, Michael couldn't reconcile their crude accounts with the life he shared with his wife. The incident occurred in a bar where Michael had joined his colleagues to toast the end of another exhausting week. A translucent glass divider separated him from the men, obscuring their faces but not their voices, which cut sharply through the ambient noise. Their careless volume hinted at inebriation, but that didn't soften the impact of their words, which pierced through Michael's reality, leaving a raw wound of disbelief and anxiety. Initially, Michael struggled to connect the conversation to his own life. By the time he started processing their remarks, a large portion of their discussion had already passed him by. What lingered in his memory was fragmented, a patchwork of phrases reconstructed from the snippets he caught after he finally began paying attention. It wasn't until one of them mentioned a name that his focus sharpened. "Carter, that woman from accounting," one of them said, his tone dripping with smugness and drunken overconfidence. Hearing his name linked to such degrading comments jolted Michael like a physical blow. It yanked him out of his casual indifference. Indeed, his wife, Rachel, worked in accounting for a well-known firm, the same company the men referenced seconds later. That detail alone made him listen more closely. However, the words they used to describe her were so far removed from the Rachel he knew and cherished that he couldn't immediately reconcile their conversation with his wife. Despite his denial, something about their remarks lodged itself deep in his mind, gnawing at him and sowing seeds of doubt. The specificity of their statements felt too precise to dismiss entirely. Restless and disturbed, he instinctively moved closer to hear more, but it seemed the conversation was already ending. One man burped loudly while the other muttered something about leaving. Peeking around the corner, Michael caught a glimpse of one man's retreating figure as he exited the bar. The individual was heavy-set with a bald patch on his head. Michael had no idea who the other man might have been. The pub was bustling with activity, making it impossible to identify him. When Michael arrived home about 30 minutes later, Rachel wasn't there. Another half hour passed and still no sign of her. He found himself wondering if his thoughts would have taken a different turn, if not for the obnoxious conversation he had overheard earlier. Or perhaps those very remarks had planted a seed of doubt. It seemed absurd. Rachel deserved her moments to unwind just as much as he did. She didn't need to stick to a schedule to decide when it was time to come home. Still, she could have called. She usually did when her plans stretched later into the evening. That was when he realized she had been doing this more often lately. Arriving home late, forgetting to call. It wasn't just tonight. These instances had been building up over months, maybe even the past year. After another hour ticked by, Michael decided to call her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. He tried her office line, but the cleaner answered and told him everyone had left hours ago. Moments later, Rachel rushed through the front door. What excuse will it be this time, Michael thought. Traffic? A flat tire? Maybe he could accept a delay. But 2 hours with no explanation? Could it have been unexpected overtime? Possible, but unlikely on a Friday evening. Besides, the office cleaner had made it clear. The place was empty. Could she have simply lost track of time with friends? Maybe, but Rachel had never been this late without at least a quick message. When she entered, she didn't offer an excuse. In fact, she said nothing except a casual, "Hi." Without hesitation, she darted upstairs to take a shower, a rare habit for her after coming home. When she returned, she looked refreshed. Her skin glowed, her damp hair framed her face, and she wore a crisp white blouse with a linen skirt. She grabbed an apron and asked Michael to set the table while she prepared dinner. He didn't respond, and she eventually noticed. After slipping a casserole into the oven and beginning to chop vegetables for a salad, she turned to him. "Is something wrong?" she asked, drying her hands. Michael met her gaze for the first time that evening. "Maybe I should be asking you," he replied. She stared back, puzzled. "Asking me what?" "I was worried. You were late? You didn't call," he said. Rachel glanced at the clock, her brow furrowing slightly. "Oh my, I didn't realize it was so late," she said, covering her mouth with one hand. She walked over, draping her arms around his neck. "I'm sorry, honey. I lost track of time." Her blue eyes locked onto his, projecting a look that could only be described as apologetic. Michael gently removed her hands from his neck and placed them between them. "Let's eat," he said, brushing off the moment. "I'm starving." Later that night, they attempted to make love, but it was an awkward, disjointed experience. Michael found himself struggling to stay in the moment, and Rachel seemed distant in a way that felt unfamiliar. It was a disaster for both of them. The next morning, they shared a quiet breakfast. Michael had a muffin while Rachel opted for cereal and fruit. They weren't big on breakfast, but the tension was palpable. Rachel, still in her robe, sipped her coffee while Michael, in his running gear, eyed her cautiously. Finally, he broke the silence. "Will talking help, Rachel?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "Help with what?" she replied. "I think you're cheating on me," he said bluntly. "I think you're seeing someone else." Rachel's expression didn't change. She didn't blink, flinch, or fidget. She just stared at him, her face unreadable. Michael's cheeks flushed hot with embarrassment and anger. "Why, Rachel?" he managed to say. "Why, Michael?" she echoed, her voice calm but sharp. Her expression shifted to something resembling disdain. "Why would you think I'm cheating on you?" Michael felt the weight of her words. She never called him by his name unless she was upset, offended, or serious. Usually it was just, "honey." Now her tone bordered on incredulous. "Why accuse me, Michael?" she demanded, her voice rising. Michael raised his hand, signaling for her to lower hers. He explained the overheard comments at the pub, her tardiness, the lack of a call, and her strange behavior, the showering, the lack of affection during their attempt at intimacy. He stumbled over his words, embarrassed by his own doubts and the awkwardness of articulating them. He hated accusing her, yet the thoughts felt unavoidable. Rachel pushed her chair back abruptly and stood, clutching her robe tightly around her. "I don't have to listen to this," she said, leaving the kitchen. Michael sat frozen, unsure of whether to follow her. Was it cowardice? Indecision? Fear? No, he realized. It was none of those. He stayed in his seat because deep down he believed he already had his answer. Rachel had always been confrontational, almost welcoming arguments when she felt wronged. Yet now, she had walked away, abandoning the discussion entirely. That silence, he thought, said everything he needed to know. She didn't fight back or try to defend herself. She walked away, leaving the conflict unresolved. That wasn't like Rachel, and Michael knew exactly why. She had no defense because he was right. Rachel had been unfaithful. When Rachel Carter came back from a quick trip to the grocery store, she stepped into an eerily quiet house. It didn't catch her off guard. In fact, she had expected it. She had deliberately purchased fewer groceries, skipping the usual cans of beer and much of the meat she'd normally buy. Michael was gone. She had been certain of it, and the empty house confirmed her prediction. A folded note sat on the kitchen counter. She read it quickly, her face betraying no emotion, then crumpled it and tossed it in the trash. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, breaking the silence. Rachel poured hot water over a tea bag and carried her cup out to the deck, where the late afternoon sun bathed her in warmth. She sipped her tea and gazed at the yard. Did she feel regret? She supposed she might miss Michael in some ways, the easy familiarity, the shared routines, and the long history they had together. But she also felt something close to relief. The truth was, she had been preparing for this moment for a long time, over 2 years to be exact. Rachel rarely stopped to analyze how she had managed to cheat on Michael so effortlessly with so little guilt. She guessed it came down to a lack of respect. He didn't command it, so she didn't give it. Michael, in her eyes, had faded into a shadow of what a man should be. Compared to others she encountered, men who were assertive and commanding, Michael felt like a placeholder. He was too accommodating, always deferring to her. What some women might see as love and devotion, Rachel found suffocating and dull. Then there was Tom Benson. If ever there was a man who embodied everything Michael was not, it was Tom. Tall, confident, and ambitious, he had joined her company 6 months ago. Tom exuded an energy that drew Rachel in immediately. It hadn't taken long for them to become lovers. Michael's discovery of her affair hadn't surprised her. If anything, it was shocking it had taken this long. His obliviousness felt like one last insult, another piece of evidence of his disinterest. Rachel's affairs had begun 2 years earlier, shortly after their daughter Emily left for college. At first, they were fleeting, flirtations that escalated unexpectedly. But recently, they had grown more deliberate. She had embraced the freedom of her newfound desires, indulging in a series of relationships with younger, attractive men. Surprisingly, finding willing partners had been easy. Rachel knew she was still beautiful. She worked hard to maintain her looks. Much of her income went toward her appearance, a carefully curated wardrobe, high-end lingerie, professional hairstyling, and flawless makeup. Michael never objected to these expenses, never even seemed to notice. She doubted he saw her as anything other than his wife of 40-something years, but the young men she met saw her as something entirely different. They were drawn to her confidence and allure, and Rachel reveled in their attention. Her life now felt worlds away from the monotonous existence she had shared with Michael. She had been clear with herself from the start. If Michael ever uncovered her infidelity, she wouldn't fight to save the marriage. She'd accept a divorce and walk away without hesitation. But she also resolved not to be reckless. She avoided taking risks that might expose her, never brought her affairs into their home, and always crafted plausible excuses for her absences. She even ensured she didn't make love to Michael on the same day she was with another man. She considered this her small concession to him, proof in her mind that she wasn't entirely heartless. Over the past year, her escapades had expanded. She had slept with colleagues, clients, and, on occasion, indulged in group encounters. These affairs weren't just thrilling. They boosted her confidence and even benefited her career. A recent promotion and a generous bonus were, she believed, indirect rewards for her boldness. But now, things were different. The thrill of sneaking around had dulled, replaced by a sense of inconvenience. Secrets were burdensome rather than exhilarating. And of course, there was Tom. Tom wasn't just another fling. He had captivated her entirely. Was it love? Rachel wasn't sure. What she did know was that she couldn't stop thinking about him. He occupied her thoughts and dreams, making her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. Tom wasn't gentle. He was rough, demanding, and unapologetic, and she craved every bit of it. When he asked her to make a life with him, she didn't hesitate to imagine what that might look like. That Friday afternoon, while 2 of her work friends loudly gossiped in a pub at her suggestion, Rachel had spent hours with Tom in a motel. She'd deliberately stayed out late and skipped the customary check-in call to Michael. When she arrived home, she didn't offer an excuse, barely acknowledging her husband before retreating for a long shower. The shower was intentional, a small breadcrumb meant to draw his suspicion. That night, she even initiated lovemaking, certain he would notice the subtle signs of her betrayal. And he had. His inability to perform was confirmation enough. By now, Rachel was over the pretense. Michael's confrontation and subsequent departure didn't rattle her. If anything, it confirmed what she already knew. Her future was no longer tied to him. Her life with Tom, unpredictable, passionate, and alive, awaited her. The wave of guilt that flickered through her was brief, but its mere presence annoyed her. The next morning, over breakfast, Rachel surprised even herself. When Michael confronted her directly, asking if she had been unfaithful, the words caught in her throat. She had orchestrated this moment, yet when it finally arrived, she couldn't bring herself to confess. Instead, she let the silence hang in the air, speaking for her. Was it lingering love for Michael that held her back? Shame? She chuckled to herself, incredulous. Maybe I do still care for him, she thought, almost amused by the notion. It wasn't love in the romantic sense, but more of a quiet, distant fondness, a bond that had dulled over the years, worn thin by routine and time. They had been married for over 21 years, their relationship forged through shared struggles, a home they had built together, and the memories that came with it. But most of those ties had already loosened, leaving only a few fragile threads. The strongest of those was Emily, their daughter, the vibrant, intelligent proof that their love had once been real. If she loved Michael at all now, it was because of Emily. Rachel sighed, taking a sip of her tea as she pondered the situation. Was she really supposed to suppress her desires? Her deep, undeniable yearning for passion, just because Michael no longer fulfilled her? Because he had grown too predictable, too dull? It felt absurd to blame herself for craving more. Denying her needs would only lead to resentment, to becoming a bitter, prematurely aged woman. What good would that do? Life was fleeting, she reasoned. To ignore its pleasures would be the real sin. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Tom. Just the sound of his voice sent a thrill through her. The day before, he had told her she was incredible, better than anyone he had ever been with. Younger women couldn't compare, he had said. The memory made her smile as she confirmed their next meeting. Tonight, he would come to her house for the first time. It felt bold, but the thought excited her. Life was sweet. With a playful smirk, she climbed the stairs to try on a new silk outfit. Her steps were light, her mood buoyant. Meanwhile, Michael was reflecting on how little he truly knew his wife. That realization, he thought, was the hardest blow of all. It was as though the foundation of his life had been ripped away, leaving only shards of memories and illusions. He wondered how he had missed the signs, how he hadn't seen Rachel drifting further from him over the past year. He had chalked it up to the empty nest, to Emily leaving for college, and to Rachel throwing herself into her full-time job. But now it was clear he had been blind. Michael considered the way he had lived his life. Like many men, he had always been focused on the future, on projects, goals, and challenges. His mind had been consumed by what was ahead, not by the present. He had trusted that Rachel would always be there, taking care of the now, while he built their future. It was naive, perhaps, but also comforting. He had believed he was secure. He realized now how little time he had spent truly observing Rachel, understanding her needs and desires. Women, he thought, lived in the present in a way men didn't. They wove their lives into the here and now, creating intricate connections between family, friends, and communities. Men, meanwhile, got lost in their own ambitions, blind to the web being spun around them. It wasn't until they were caught, like he was now, that they finally noticed. Michael's thoughts wandered as he sat alone in a shabby motel a few miles from home. He had left the house early that morning, throwing a suitcase into the car and driving aimlessly until he landed there. Unable to sit still, he decided to go for a hike, something he hadn't done in years. Rachel had never shared his love for the outdoors. She was more drawn to beaches and shopping malls. But hiking had always been his escape, his way of finding clarity. As he walked through the woods, memories of his younger self came flooding back. He had been adventurous then, exploring trails and rafting rivers. Meeting Rachel had changed everything. She had been out of his league, a vibrant social whirlwind compared to his quiet, serious demeanor. She was beautiful and full of life, and he had been completely captivated. He had never understood why she chose him, but he didn't question it. He simply drank in her passion, feeling as though he had been saved from a barren existence. In those early years, their connection had felt unshakable. They had faced challenges together, finding joy in even the simplest things. And then there was Emily, their miracle. Her birth had been complicated, and while it hadn't endangered Rachel's life, it had meant they couldn't have more children. Rachel's hysterectomy had been a painful but necessary decision. As Michael walked, he couldn't help but wonder if their love had simply run its course. Had it been doomed from the start, a mismatch that only time could reveal? Or had he failed to nurture it, too consumed by his own distractions to notice Rachel slipping away? Whatever the answer, he knew one thing for certain. The life they had shared was gone, and there was no going back. Was loyalty proof of love? Michael wondered as he trekked through the dunes, the coarse sand crunching beneath his boots and the tall grasses whispering in the wind. Years ago, when Rachel had been forced into a hysterectomy after Emily's birth, he hadn't hesitated. He'd shared her fate and had a vasectomy. At the time, it had seemed the ultimate act of solidarity, a quiet declaration of their shared future. Whether she had appreciated the gesture was something he couldn't recall. More recently, her words stung. "What if you meet someone else and want kids?" she had asked last year, her tone sharp with incredulity. He'd laughed it off, thinking she was joking, but now her question gnawed at him. The wind, sharp and relentless, began to clear the fog in his mind. He realized how much of his recent past had blurred into an indistinct haze. The numbness had become so familiar he hadn't even noticed it. As he sat on a fallen tree trunk overlooking the valley, it dawned on him. Some kinds of love aren't healthy. They creep into your soul, eating away at your confidence, blinding you to the cracks in your partner's affection, and quietly convincing you to abandon parts of yourself. For the first time in years, he noticed the vibrant green of the May trees, the dazzling blue of a freshly washed sky, and the shimmer of sunlight on a winding stream. The beauty was almost too much, like seeing a world he'd forgotten existed. The pain came next, raw and unfiltered. He thought about how, for years, he had softened the sharp edges of reality to avoid confronting the truth about Rachel. It was as though he'd coated his life in a protective film, a Vaseline blur over the lens of his marriage. But now, sitting alone on that tree, the veil was gone, ripped away to expose the stark, unforgiving truth. His shoulders shook as muffled sobs escaped him. It wasn't just Rachel's betrayal that overwhelmed him. It was the realization of how much he had betrayed himself. Sorting through the wreckage of their life together felt impossible in that moment. The memories, the love, the hurt, they all poured out in a chaotic flood. But as he sat there, he began to sift through it, piece by piece. Among the debris, there was one undeniable jewel: Emily. No matter what else crumbled, she remained his anchor, the proof of what had once been beautiful between him and Rachel. The sun was dipping low now, its golden light casting long shadows. Michael rose stiffly, his legs protesting, and began the slow walk back to his motel. He had a phone call to make. Rachel Carter barely paused as she shook out her polished nails, the deep burgundy shade gleaming under the bedroom's soft light. She held her phone gingerly, careful not to smudge the glossy finish. Emily's voice, tinny and concerned, came through the speaker. "Dad just called. He said he left you. Mom, what's going on?" Rachel groaned inwardly, her annoyance flickering to the surface before she smoothed it over. Did Michael have to tell Emily now, of all times? "Honey, don't worry," she said, keeping her tone sweet and steady. "We'll talk about it tomorrow, okay? This isn't a conversation to have over the phone." "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily pressed. "What happened?" Rachel glanced at the clock. Tom would be there any minute and she wasn't even dressed. "Darling, it's nothing you need to stress over. Just adult stuff between your dad and me. Let's meet tomorrow, okay? Noon at that little cafe by the gym." There was a heavy pause on the line, but Rachel didn't wait for Emily to respond. "I really have to go now, sweetie. Love you." She hung up, slipping the phone back onto the vanity as she stood and stepped into her burgundy heels. The shoes added an extra 4 inches, making her legs look longer as she examined herself in the full-length mirror. Tucking her blouse into her skirt, she admired the way the fabric clung to her body. A satisfied smile curled on her lips. "You're stunning," she whispered to her reflection as the doorbell rang. The next day, Michael sat across from Emily in a small, intimate Italian restaurant. Her eyes, wide and searching, never left his face. "You look tired," she said softly, her concern evident. Michael gave her a small, weary smile. "It's good to see you, sweetheart," he said, reaching out to hold her hand. After the waitress brought their drinks and bread, Emily finally asked the question he had been dreading. "Dad, what happened? What's going on with Mom?" Michael swirled the wine in his glass, watching the ruby liquid catch the candlelight. He took a breath. "Your mother doesn't need me anymore." Emily's gasp cut through the cozy atmosphere. "What do you mean? What are you saying?" Michael placed a hand over hers. "Sweetheart, when your mother and I met, it was magic. Everything about her, her energy, her beauty, she swept me off my feet. We were deeply in love. You were the greatest gift of that love. If you ever want proof of how much we cared for each other, just look in the mirror. You're the best of us." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she listened. Michael's voice wavered as he continued. "But things change, honey. Over time, your mom stopped loving me the way she used to. I didn't see it then, or maybe I didn't want to, but now I know." Emily looked stricken, her hands trembling. "Dad, He shook his head gently. "Don't blame yourself. This isn't about you. It's about your mom and me, and how we let each other slip away." He squeezed her hand. "But I'll always love you. That's never going to change." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was also full of understanding. For the first time, Michael felt a glimmer of peace. Emily was his clarity, his connection to what had once been real and beautiful. And that, at least, was something worth holding on to. Michael paused, glancing down at the table before meeting Emily's tear-filled eyes. She had begun shaking her head, her blonde hair falling across her face as if to physically block out what she was hearing. He lifted a hand gently to calm her. "Sweetheart, listen," he began, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I think, over time, I just wasn't enough for your mother. Maybe she needed someone stronger, more assertive, someone ambitious, who could light up a room and command attention. But that's never been who I am. I thought she loved me for being myself, for being steady." A faint, regretful smile touched his lips. He glanced away, lost in thought for a moment. I gave her everything I thought she wanted. I worked hard, gave her comfort and stability, but maybe I never really gave her what she needed. Emily looked at him, her confusion evident, her eyes pleading for clarity. He pressed on, his words strangely calm, as though he had rehearsed them in his mind. The truth is, honey, time changes things. It wears you down quietly and relentlessly. It doesn't just dull your passion, it makes you stop noticing the things that used to matter. And sometimes you wake up one day and realize you've let something precious slip away. Please, Daddy, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. He reached across the table to squeeze her hand. I'm sorry. I shouldn't burden you with this, but I want you to know it doesn't mean I didn't love her. I loved her deeply, and I loved you with everything I had. That love made every long day at work worth it. But looking back, maybe I didn't express it in the ways she needed most. Emily's hand tightened around his as their appetizers arrived. She picked at her salad, her appetite gone. Michael pushed the antipasti around his plate without tasting a bite. Your mother and I saw life differently, he continued after a heavy pause. I poured myself into work and the joy of creating and building. I thought that was enough for both of us. But for her, I don't think it was. And then, when you grew up and left for college, she found herself alone with time and no one to fill it with. I didn't see how hard that was for her. Emily's face paled. He hesitated, afraid of saying too much, but he had already come this far. After you left, she started changing. She worked more, dressed differently, spent more time at the gym, and I thought it was just her way of dealing with the empty nest. I wanted to support her, but now, looking back, I see she was searching for something else. Something I wasn't giving her. Emily's voice was small, barely above a whisper. It wasn't just work, was it? Michael exhaled slowly, as though releasing a weight he had carried for too long. No, honey, I don't think it was. At first, maybe she convinced herself it was about career or independence, but eventually, it became something more. Proof, I guess. Proof that she was still vibrant, still noticed, still desirable. Emily looked down at her plate, tears falling silently. Did you talk to her about it? She asked after a moment. Michael shook his head. We didn't. We drifted. We lived side by side, but not together. I didn't ask, and she didn't offer. I thought she seemed happy. I was busy, always busy. Emily's eyes searched his, desperate for some hopeful resolution. Maybe it's just a phase. Maybe she'll regret it, Dad. He smiled sadly, shaking his head. No, honey, I don't think so. This isn't just about other men. It's about her finding validation in a way I can't give her. I don't think she'll stop, and I don't think she wants to. You have to talk to her, Emily said, her voice breaking. I will, if it matters to you, he replied, though his tone carried little conviction. Daddy, Emily said, her voice cracking. This is so unfair. It's so sad. Michael nodded, his own sadness reflected in his daughter's face. It is, sweetheart, but we can't change it now. The only thing we can do is move forward. The waitress arrived with their pastas, removing the barely touched appetizers. Emily picked up her fork, though the weight of the conversation had stolen her appetite. Michael leaned forward, his voice gentle. Eat, honey. You need your strength. Emily nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she twirled pasta onto her fork. As they ate in silence, the heaviness of the moment hung between them, unspoken but understood. For Michael, there was a bittersweet comfort in knowing that even as his marriage unraveled, his bond with his daughter remained strong. Rachel Carter settled into a shadowed corner of the terrace, her damp hair framing her glowing face. The sheen wasn't from the gym equipment she had just used, nor solely from the UV session she had indulged in. It was the result of her luxury cream, a potion she paid handsomely for to maintain her youthful look. She knew better than to risk the harshness of the sun at her age. Her gym routine had started decades ago, back when Emily was born. Determined to shed the weight of pregnancy, Rachel had become relentless with her fitness. 3 days a week became every other day in recent years, and she had no regrets. The payoff was obvious. The way younger men flirted with her, the approving glances she caught in mirrors, the ease with which she slipped into dresses she'd worn in her 20s. Even here, surrounded by toned bodies, Rachel knew she held her own. She didn't need surgery. Her firm physique and naturally smooth skin outshone the frozen Botox masks of her competition. Sipping her fruit juice, Rachel smiled in quiet satisfaction. Her world felt perfect until it didn't. Across the terrace, Emily appeared, weaving through tables with effortless grace. The resemblance was striking. The golden curls, sunlit and natural, bounced freely. Her complexion glowed with an unspoiled vitality. Her blue eyes sparkled with innocence, and her movements carried no pretense. Emily wasn't trying to captivate anyone. She simply existed, and that was enough. Rachel felt a sharp pang in her chest. Envy, though she refused to name it as such. Rising to greet her daughter, she leaned in for a kiss that never landed, their lips brushing only air. Pleasantries came first, followed by brief updates and a second round of juice. But soon, a quiet tension settled over the table. Emily, always perceptive, noticed the lack of warmth in her mother's small talk, a disinterest she had never felt before. Something had shifted after her dinner with Michael. Her father's words had cast her mother in a new light, pulling Rachel from the shadows into sharp focus. What Emily now saw was no longer the mother she had idolized, but a complex, flawed individual, stripped of the unconditional love that had once clouded her judgment. Emily set her glass down firmly. "Mom, you know why I'm here. What's going on?" Rachel hesitated, her lashes fluttering as if buying time. "Oh, honey, it's unfortunate. But these things happen all the time, don't they?" Her voice was soft, rehearsed. "Your father and I, we've grown apart. It's just one of those things. I always thought we'd grow old together, but..." She sighed, reaching for Emily's hand. "It wasn't meant to be. But please know that we both love you. That will never change." Emily stared at her, stunned. The words felt hollow, plucked from a script. She couldn't believe her mother thought she'd accept such cliches. Waving a hand dismissively, Emily interrupted, her voice sharp. "Mom, come on. It's me, Emily, your daughter who's almost as smart as you are. Cut the act." Rachel blinked, her polished composure cracking for an instant. Was that a blush creeping under her carefully applied makeup? She sighed again, this time with less conviction. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. You're right. I've been awful. I don't know how to explain this." "Try the truth," Emily shot back, surprised by her own boldness. She had never spoken to her mother like this, but Rachel's pretense left her no choice. Rachel shifted in her designer chair, her manicured nails tapping her glass. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, vanishing almost as quickly as it appeared. "Emily, this is really between your father and me. We've changed. That's all. People grow apart. Please, let's not make this harder than it needs to be." The casual dismissal lit a fire in Emily. "That's it? That's all you have to say?" she demanded, her voice tight with anger she hadn't expected to feel. Rachel closed her eyes briefly, her lips trembling. "It's for the best, darling. Believe me." Before Emily could respond, a voice called out from the terrace entrance. Rachel turned, her body stiffening. A tall, well-groomed man with golden hair approached, exuding confidence. He looked to be in his mid-30s. Rachel stood awkwardly, her eyes darting between Emily and the man as he reached their table. For the first time in years, Rachel seemed unsure of herself. The man resolved the tension himself, pulling Rachel into a hug. His mouth moved toward hers, but she turned her head at the last moment, leaving his kiss to land on her cheek. "Tom," she said, her voice shaky. "This is my daughter, Emily. Emily, meet Tom. We work together." Emily's sharp eyes flicked between her mother and Tom, taking in every detail. Her mind raced as she tried to process what she was witnessing. Whatever this was, it went far beyond work. Emily smiled politely as she shook Tom's hand, enduring his smooth compliments with forced civility. She noticed everything about him. The crisp white polo stretched across his broad chest, the perfectly tailored slacks, the golden tan of his arms. He even had the audacity to joke that she and Rachel could pass for sisters. Then he leaned in close to Rachel, murmuring something just out of earshot. Rachel's nervous nod and subtle push to distance herself from him only added to the awkwardness. Tom laughed loudly, said, "See ya, honey," and strolled back toward the entrance where two of his buddies waited. A burst of laughter followed them as they disappeared inside. Emily turned her attention to her mother, her jaw tightening. "Are you sleeping with him, Mom?" she asked bluntly, her voice low but cutting. Rachel froze, the color draining from her face before it was replaced by a flush of anger. "Where do you get off speaking to me like that, Emily?" she snapped. "I'm your mother. I don't have to answer such a question." Emily didn't flinch. "You are, aren't you? It's obvious. How long has this been going on? Did Dad find out?" Rachel's voice climbed an octave. "You're wrong. You have no idea what you're talking about. Tom and I work together. We're friends. That's it. Friends. Can a woman have friends without being judged by her self-righteous daughter?" Her outburst drew glances from nearby tables, but Emily remained calm. She pushed her chair back slowly, the scrape of its legs harsh against the stone patio. Friends, huh? Is that really all you have to say? Rachel stopped her frantic gestures, her purse clutched tightly in her hands. Her voice hardened. I don't owe you any explanations, Emily. Emily stood, her expression cold. Fine. Don't bother calling me until you're ready to be honest. Preferably with the truth. Rachel gasped, reaching out as though to stop her. Emily, no, don't listen to your father. He's poisoning you against me. You don't understand. Emily froze mid-turn, throwing a sharp look over her shoulder. You mean Dad? God, you don't know him at all, do you? Did you ever? You're pathetic, Mom. Enjoy yourself. Without another word, Emily strode away, her blonde curls bouncing with each step. Rachel stood rooted in place, gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Screw you, Michael, she hissed under her breath. Screw you. For the first time in what felt like years, Michael slept soundly that night. The weight of recent events had lifted slightly, replaced by the kind of clarity that spurred action. It wasn't just the hike or the dinner with Emily. It was the plan forming in his mind. A good plan, one that brought a flicker of excitement and purpose back into his life. Yesterday, he had reached out to Frank, an old friend he hadn't seen in months. Guilt tugged at him for calling out of the blue, but Frank had been gracious. After all, isn't that what lifelong friends are for? The two had known each other since grade school, their bond enduring through years of separation when Frank went away for college. They'd reconnected when Frank returned to open a psychology practice, and their families had become close, until Rachel abruptly cut ties 2 years ago. She never gave a clear reason, leaving Michael embarrassed and confused. Frank's wife Marie had apparently felt the same, and the friendship between the two families dissolved without explanation. Despite Rachel's insistence that he keep his distance, Michael had maintained his friendship with Frank, sneaking in the occasional night of pool or beer at the bar. Last night, he'd unloaded everything. Rachel's infidelity, the moment he discovered it, and her cold reaction when confronted. He spoke about the emptiness he'd been living with, the gray fog that had settled over his life for years without his noticing. Frank listened intently, his expression shifting from concern to alarm. When Michael paused, Frank surprised him with an apology, not as a friend, but as a psychologist. I should have seen it, Frank admitted, guilt in his voice. You've been showing classic signs of depression for years. I should have noticed. The words hit Michael hard, but they also rang true. Frank explained how Michael's withdrawal, his obsession with work, and his detachment from the world were all symptoms. Even Michael's tendency to blame himself for Rachel's unhappiness was part of the illness. Frank described how depression creeps in quietly, often unnoticed by even those closest to the person suffering. Your job didn't notice as long as you performed. Emily was too busy starting her own life to see it. And Rachel? Frank hesitated. Rachel had her own distractions. Michael nodded slowly, the realization settling over him. Depression had dulled his senses and his spirit, leaving him vulnerable. Rachel's emotional withdrawal and eventual betrayal had only deepened the wound. Yet, he understood now that he hadn't failed because he wasn't good enough. He had been fighting an invisible enemy all along. Frank's words gave Michael something he hadn't felt in years: clarity. He was no longer willing to wallow in blame or let Rachel's choices define his future. As he left the bar that night, a plan began to form, a way to rebuild himself, reclaim his happiness, and let go of the weight he had carried for far too long. It wasn't about revenge or fixing the past. It was about moving forward, one step at a time. Rachel Carter stared out the airplane window as the Vegas skyline vanished beneath the clouds. The man beside her, with his chiseled jaw and confident air, should have been a source of excitement. But as the plane climbed, the rush of takeoff filled her not with butterflies, but with emptiness. Vegas had promised her everything, a whirlwind escape of opulence and indulgence. Tom had spared no expense. Their sprawling suite overlooking the city, lavish dinners, dazzling shows, and endless compliments. She had soaked in his undivided attention, relishing the fantasy of being adored. The nights were a blur of passion, leaving her body sore and covered in bruises. Yet instead of fulfillment, she felt hollow, like a shiny facade stripped bare. The first day had felt like heaven. She could still picture the moment they stepped into their suite, its glittering view of the city spreading out before them like a dream. Overwhelmed by excitement, she'd thrown herself into Tom's arms, their clothes discarded in a frantic rush before the bellboy had even closed the door. From there, it was a carousel of decadence: swimming, shopping, fine dining, and dancing. but the cracks began to show when they returned to the suite that night. Tom had kissed her hungrily in the elevator, whispering for her to take a long shower and make herself irresistible for him. She had giggled, drunk on his attention, and retreated to the bathroom, her body scented with perfume. When she stepped out, she expected to find something luxurious laid out for her, perhaps a silk negligee or a set of elegant lingerie. Instead, on the bed were a pair of cheap fishnet stockings and absurdly high red platform heels. Her excitement wavered, but she tried to laugh it off, calling for Tom. There was no answer. "Tom!" she called again, slipping the stockings up her legs with hesitant hands. She tottered awkwardly in the heels, feeling ridiculous. The door to the suite swung open. The man who entered was not Tom. He was a giant in a crisp blue suit, flanked by two similarly dressed men. Rachel's stomach plummeted. "Wrong room," she said, her voice a nervous squeak. "You've got the wrong room. Please leave." The men didn't stop. They chuckled, their laughter low and predatory. "Tom! Tom!" Rachel shouted, desperation creeping into her voice. But the men only laughed harder. What followed was a night she could barely piece together. Flashes of pain, humiliation, and fear lingered in her memory like shards of broken glass. When she finally woke, the sun was streaming through the windows, and the clock read nearly noon. Her body felt like a battlefield. Bruises and bites covered her skin, and the sheets clung to her in damp, sticky patches. Stumbling into the bathroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror and groaned. Mascara streaked her face, her lipstick smudged and smeared. White powder lined her nostrils, traces of a substance she didn't remember taking. The shower's jets pummeled her sore body, the hot water washing away some of her physical exhaustion, but none of her shame. When the steam cleared, she inspected herself again. The bites and bruises were unmistakable. Even the soft bathrobe felt abrasive against her skin. Back in the suite, a fresh breakfast tray awaited her. The food was still warm, so it must have been delivered while she was in the shower. She sat down, ravenous, halfway through her scrambled eggs when the door to the suite opened again. Her heart sank. Tom strolled into the suite wearing an immaculate Armani suit and his trademark smug grin. Before Rachel could react, he grabbed her shoulders from behind, his presence immediately suffocating. She jerked away, her voice sharp and defiant. "Get your hands off me!" she shouted, her face a mix of anger and humiliation. Tom chuckled, dodging the spoon she hurled at him. "Relax, honey," he said casually, as if her outrage were an overreaction. Rachel's voice rose, trembling with fury. "Relax? You left me with those monsters! What the hell is wrong with you? I've never felt so humiliated in my life!" He seized her flailing arms, pinning them to her sides. His face hovered inches from hers, his tone dripping with mockery. "Humiliated? Really, Rachel? You're a better actress than I thought. If you didn't love every second of it, you should win an Oscar." Releasing her roughly, Tom stepped back, his grin unfazed. Rachel collapsed into a chair, her wet hair clinging to her face. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Tape?" Tom smirked, helping himself to a sausage from her breakfast plate. "Oh, yes. You're the star, sweetheart. And the best part? It's just episode 1 of 3. On the plane back from Vegas, Rachel sat beside him, her oversized sunglasses barely concealing the dark circles under her eyes. Her head pounded, the hangover pressing against her temples like a vice. "I thought you cared about me," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion and betrayal. Tom looked up from his magazine, grinning as if she'd told a joke. "Who, me?" he asked, his tone dripping with insincerity. Tears brimmed in her eyes. He patted her arm, feigning sympathy. "Of course I care, honey. You have no idea how much money you made me this weekend." Rachel turned her face to the window, her silent sobs shaking her shoulders. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had been nothing but a pawn in his game, decades of life experience, and she had learned nothing since she was a teenager. Tom hadn't let her leave the suite after the first night. He ordered a masseuse to soothe her battered body and had food sent up via room service. He also forced pills into her hand, making her swallow them without question. Then he dressed her like a doll in a cheap vinyl outfit with impossibly high platform boots. He sent her back to the bathroom to perfect her appearance until her reflection matched his fantasies. The second night was worse. 5 men this time. 2 were overweight. 1 was old enough to be her father, and she barely remembered when she passed out. The morning after, she begged to leave, even threatening to harm herself, but Tom had only laughed. By the time they left Vegas, Rachel was a shell of herself. She shuffled through the airport like an elderly woman, her oversized sunglasses doing little to mask her misery. "I hate you," she muttered as they settled into their seats. Tom didn't even glance at her, flipping a page in his magazine. "I know, honey," he said with a dismissive smirk. Meanwhile, Michael was closing the chapter on his old life. The door to what had once been his home shut softly behind him. He slipped the key into his pocket and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The day promised sunshine, a fitting backdrop to the transformation he was about to embark on. The past few days had been a whirlwind, finalizing divorce papers, resigning from his job of over 20 years and packing up what little he wanted to take with him had been both exhausting and liberating. He left behind a career he had poured himself into and a house that no longer felt like home. What remained was clarity, the kind that came from wiping a slate clean. That morning, he took one last walk through the empty house. The familiar rooms were stripped of most personal touches. A few photos were gone, and closets stood half empty. But the space felt lighter, as if it too had been unburdened. In the kitchen, Michael placed a thick envelope against the vase Emily had made in kindergarten, a misshapen but cherished piece. Inside the envelope were divorce papers and the business card of his lawyer. Rachel would find it when she returned. It was all she needed to move forward, without him. Stepping outside, Michael's gaze landed on the camper waiting in the driveway, its silver exterior gleaming in the morning sun. Running a hand along its aluminum side, he felt a rush of anticipation. Climbing into the driver's seat, he gripped the large steering wheel and was transported back to childhood, sitting in his Uncle William's lap in a massive truck. He could almost hear his uncle's booming voice. "Go, Michael! Let's hit the road!" The camper's engine roared to life as he turned the key. For a moment, he looked back at the house. The sun was casting long shadows across its facade, and a small black and white cat leapt over the fence, returning from its nightly adventures. Michael smiled at the sound of the camper's wheels crunching on the gravel. "Let's hit the road," he whispered, pulling away and leaving the past behind. Michael's first stop wasn't far, just 30 miles down the road at Emily's college campus. She could have stayed at home and commuted, but Emily had been eager for the full college experience. Michael had missed her when she left, but never said so, though Rachel had encouraged her to go, talking up independence and freedom. At the time, he hadn't realized Rachel might have been advocating for her own. He pulled into a small diner just off campus, its red and white awning flapping in the morning breeze. It was early, but that was perfect. It gave him time with Emily before her first class. Through the window, he saw her seated at a table, sunlight catching the blue of her eyes and the warmth of her smile. Everything about the day felt new, as if he were seeing the world through fresh eyes. They embraced tightly before sitting down. "You're really doing this?" Emily asked, her expression both incredulous and amused. Michael grinned. "Let an old man chase a boyhood dream, darling," Emily laughed. "I'll allow as many as you can dream up." They ordered breakfast, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. Their conversation drifted over fond memories and funny stories, deliberately avoiding the subject of Rachel. Time slipped by too quickly. Michael glanced at his watch and reached across the table to hold Emily's hands. "Em, before I go, I need 3 promises from you," he said. "3?" she teased. "That's all?" "3," he repeated. "First, I want you to be as happy as you possibly can." Her fingers tightened around his. "That's an easy one," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "Promise me," he insisted. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. "Promise," she said softly. "Second," Michael continued, "talk to Rachel. When she calls, give her a chance." The warmth in her expression faltered. "Daddy!" "Promise me," he pressed, his grip firm. A long silence followed before Emily gave a reluctant nod. "Promise. But only if she tells the truth." Michael studied her face, then nodded. "Fair enough," he said. "Third," he pulled a shiny quarter from his pocket and held it up. "I want you to flip this coin. Heads, I go east. Tails, I go west." Emily laughed, the heaviness between them lifting for a moment. She took the coin and flipped it high into the air, the silver flashing as it caught the light. When it landed, she slapped it onto her hand and revealed the result. "Tails!" she said, grinning. Michael stood and hugged her tightly. They walked out to the parking lot together, where Emily gasped at the sight of the camper. "Wow, Dad, it's huge!" He showed her around, her admiration growing with each detail. Before they parted, he handed her a slip of paper. "This is my new number," he said. "No one else has it. It's just for you." "I promise," she said, tucking it into her bag. They hugged once more, both crying, before Michael climbed into the driver's seat. As he drove away, he saw her wave in the side mirror, her figure growing smaller with each mile. Rachel arrived home to find a single key gleaming on the red doormat. She had expected to shove the door open against a pile of mail and papers, but there was none. Picking up the key, she stepped inside, immediately struck by the silence. Something felt off. Walking into the living room, she noticed a blank spot on the wall above the couch. The photo of Michael and Emily from their Disney trip years ago was gone. She frowned. Who had taken it? Everything else seemed untouched. In the kitchen, an envelope sat propped against a vase Emily had made in elementary school. The single word Rachel was written on the front in Michael's handwriting. Her heart clenched as she stared at it, unwilling to reach for it just yet. After landing earlier that day, Tom had disappeared without so much as helping her collect her luggage. She had barely enough cash for a cab ride home. Now, sitting at the kitchen table, the exhaustion and humiliation of the past few days overwhelmed her. Her trembling hand hovered over the envelope before she finally picked it up. "Congratulations, Rachel," she muttered bitterly, tears streaming down her face. "Well done." Her voice echoed hollowly in the empty room. She broke down, sobbing into her hands. The divorce was finalized without Michael's presence. He'd chosen not to attend, leaving his lawyer to handle the proceedings. Rachel, seated alone in the courtroom, tried to plead her case, insisting she wanted to reconcile. But Michael had already made his decision. His terms were more than fair. Rachel would keep the house and receive a substantial financial settlement. The judge, seeing no grounds for delay, closed the case swiftly despite Rachel's attempts to stall. While Rachel sat in the courtroom, her face a mask of despair, Michael was parked by a tranquil lake miles away. Seated in his camper with a steaming cup of coffee, he watched the sunlight dance on the water's surface. For the first time in years, he felt free, not just from the weight of his marriage, but from the shadows that had clouded his life for so long. As crisp autumn winds swirled through the trees, Michael's heartache had softened into a bittersweet calm. He had done everything he could to end his marriage with dignity, even after enduring the sting of betrayal. Meanwhile, Tom's arrogance became his undoing, a stark reminder of the consequences of crossing the wrong people. His downfall began when he pursued a married woman whose loyalty lay firmly with her husband. Outraged by the affair, the husband sought out a notorious fixer known for handling dirty work. Days later, Tom was discovered in a shallow grave outside the city, a victim of his own reckless decisions. The news of Tom's violent end eventually reached Rachel, compounding the chaos of her already crumbling life. Oblivious to Tom's fate, Michael found solace on the road. Driving mile after mile, the weight of the past began to lift. Though the betrayal still lingered, so did a spark of hope. His camper became a sanctuary, a moving symbol of resilience where he could rebuild his life, free from the lies and manipulations that had once entangled him. Rachel, meanwhile, sat in her darkened room, staring at the empty glass beside her bed. Another sleepless night bore down on her, as harsh words replayed in her mind. "You're only good for one time." The man who said it had smirked as he buttoned his shirt and walked out without a second thought. She swallowed the tears threatening to rise, determined not to cry again. She had convinced herself she could start over. Dating apps, flirty conversations, and late nights out were supposed to be a fresh start. But instead, it felt like a series of hollow encounters, leaving her emptier than before. Each man was the same, charming over drinks, tender in the moment, full of whispered promises that evaporated by morning. When the bed went cold, so did their interest, leaving Rachel with nothing but shame and fleeting memories. She told herself it was fine, that this was how modern dating worked. But deep down, it wasn't fine. She wanted more, something real, something she had once thrown away. Lying in the dark, Rachel's eyes lingered on a framed photo atop her dresser. It was her and Michael, taken years earlier during a mountain getaway. She could almost hear his laughter, feel the steady comfort of his presence. He had been loyal, dependable, and kind, qualities she hadn't fully appreciated until they were gone. Now the men she met barely bothered to pretend they cared. To them, she was nothing more than a fleeting thrill. What stung the most was her pride. Once she had been in control, the one men pursued. Now she was just another fleeting conquest, her name buried in their phones like an afterthought. The realization churned her stomach. For the first time in years, Rachel felt a profound loneliness, not the kind that came from being single, but the kind that stemmed from knowing she had lost something she could never get back. As she lay in the darkness, a painful truth settled over her. She had traded genuine love for fleeting excitement, and now all she had left was an empty bed and a hollow heart.